The wind that tore across the Wyoming Territory in late November of 1878 did not just chill the skin, it sought to scrape the meat from the bone. It howled down from the granite peaks of the distant mountains, gathering speed over miles of gray, frozen sagebrush until it slammed against the walls of the Hale Ranch house. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of beeswax and cedar. Yet Margaret Hale felt a coldness deep in her marrow that no fire could touch. She stood in the center of the parlor, her hands clasped so tightly before her that the knuckles had turned the color of old parchment. The rug beneath her boots was a rich crimson, imported from the east, a stark contrast to the dust that coated the rest of the world outside. Thomas stood by the fireplace, his back to her. His silhouette was broad, familiar, the shape of the man she had shared a bed with for 5 years. But when he turned, his face was a stranger's map of resentment. 5 years. Margaret, Thomas said, his voice flat and hard like a stone skipping over ice. 5 years of feeding you, clothing you, and waiting. He did not shout. Thomas Hale rarely shouted. He possessed the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who owned the land as far as the eye could see, and believed he owned the people on it as well. Sitting in the high-backed velvet armchair was his mother, Elara Hale. Her face was a withered apple, lined with grim dissatisfaction, her eyes sharp and dark. Beside her stood Silas, Thomas's father, looking at the floor as if studying the grain of the wood to avoid seeing the woman they were destroying. "It is not just the time," Thomas continued, stepping closer. He smelled of tobacco and bay rum, a scent that used to make Maggie's heart race, but now only made her stomach churn with a sudden, violent nausea. "It is the uselessness of it. A ranch is not a painting to be looked at. It is blood and lineage. It is legacy. You have given me nothing but silence in the nursery and whispers in the town." Maggie swallowed, the taste of bile rising in her throat. She fought the urge to press a hand to her lower belly. She had missed her monthly bleeding. It had been 6 weeks. The sickness had started 3 days ago. The familiar heaviness in her breasts, the fatigue that dragged at her eyelids. She knew the signs. She had known them 3 times before, but she said nothing. To speak now would be to invite a different kind of horror. The last time, when she had lost the babe in the 4th month, Thomas had not held her. He had thrown a crystal decanter against the wall and left her bleeding in the sheets, shouting that her body was a graveyard. If she told him now, and if she lost this one too, his rage would not just be noise, it would be a physical thing. The bruises on her upper arms, currently hidden by her wool sleeves, were fading yellow echoes of his frustration from a week ago when she had dropped a dinner plate. "I have tried." "Thomas," Maggie whispered. Her voice trembled, betraying her. "Tried?" Elara scoffed from the chair. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. "Do not speak of trying. Cows try, mares try, and they succeed. You are barren, girl. It is a rot in you. God has seen fit to close your womb because you are unfit." The word hung in the room. Unfit. It was the verdict of the entire valley. Maggie felt the weight of it every time she went into town for supplies. She saw it in the pitying glances of the shopkeep's wife, heard it in the snickers of the ranch hands when they thought she was out of earshot. A woman in this hard country had one primary utility. If she could not weather the labor of childbirth, she was as useless as a lame horse. Thomas walked to the small writing desk and picked up a heavy envelope. He held it out. Maggie did not take it. "Take it," he commanded. She reached out, her fingers shaking, and grasped the thick paper. "There is $50 in there," Thomas said, "and a letter for the solicitor in Cheyenne. I am seeking an annulment. I have grounds. Fraud. You presented yourself as a capable wife. You are not." "Annulment," Maggie breathed. "But we have been married 5 years, and not a single heir to show for it," Silas muttered from the corner, finally speaking. "Just cut the cord. Son, let her go." Thomas looked at her, his eyes devoid of any lingering affection. There was only the cold calculation of a businessman cutting a loss. "Pack your things. Margaret, not the jewelry, not the silk dresses I bought you for the spring socials. Just what you came with. I want you off Hale Land before the sun is down." "But the storm," Maggie said, panic finally cracking her composure. "Thomas, look at the window. The sky is turning black. It is freezing." "Then you best hurry," Alara said, taking a sip of her tea. Maggie looked at Thomas, searching for a flicker of the man who had once courted her, who had brought her wildflowers in the spring. She saw only a wall. He was already mentally rewriting his future, one that did not include her. "You are a mistake," Thomas said softly. "Correcting it is the only way to save this ranch." Maggie turned and walked out of the parlor. She did not run. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. She climbed the wide oak staircase, her legs feeling like lead, and went to the room that was no longer hers. She packed a small, battered leather trunk, 2 wool dresses, her gray coat, a pair of sturdy boots, a Bible, and a hairbrush. She left the pearls on the vanity. She left the silk shawl. She left the illusion that she was a person of value in this house. When she came back down, the house was silent. No one came to the door to see her out. The foreman, a man named Cobb, who had always looked at her with a mixture of lust and disdain, was waiting with a buckboard wagon. He did not help her lift her trunk. She heaved it into the back, the strain pulling tight across her abdomen, and she paused, breathless, protecting the secret inside her. "You take the old mare," Cobb said, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "Boss says she is past her prime anyway." "Fitting." Maggie climbed onto the wooden seat. The wind hit her instantly, biting through her shawl, stinging her eyes. She took the reins. She did not look back at the big house with its warm, glowing windows. She snapped the reins, and the old mare groaned, pulling the rattling wagon forward into the teeth of the coming blizzard. The world became a void of white and gray. For the first hour, there was a road, distinct and rutted, winding through the vast Hale acreage. But as the afternoon wore on, the light began to fail, strangled by the heavy, low-hanging clouds. The wind picked up, screaming across the flatlands, driving snow horizontally into Maggie's face. She wrapped her scarf tighter, her head bowed. The $50 in her pocket felt like nothing. Where would she go? Cheyenne was 3 days' ride. The nearest town, Oak Haven, was 10 miles away. But the road there was treacherous in this weather. And what would she do in town? The boarding house would demand references. The women would talk. The barren Hale wife, cast off like a husk. The cold began to seep through her gloves, turning her fingers into stiff claws. The old mare plodded onward, head down, fighting the gale. The landscape was terrifying in its emptiness. Miles of sagebrush, dusted white, looking like the skeletal remains of a drowned forest. Distant mountains were swallowed by the storm, erasing the horizon. Maggie felt very small, a speck of dust on a giant's table, easily brushed away. She felt the nausea again, rolling in waves. She clamped her jaw shut. Not now. Please, not now. The wagon hit a rut, jarring her bones. The wheels groaned in protest. The wind howled, sounding eerily like the coyotes that gathered near the creek beds at night, waiting for something to die. 2 hours in, the light was nearly gone. The snow was falling faster, thick heavy flakes that stuck to her eyelashes and blinded the path. She was nearing the boundary of the Hale land. There was a long, sagging fence line that marked the edge of Thomas's kingdom and the beginning of the open range and the smaller, poorer holdings beyond. The mare stumbled. Maggie pulled up on the reins, but the horse was exhausted. The animal lurched forward, trying to regain its footing on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. The wagon slewed sideways. There was a sickening crack, loud as a gunshot. The rear left wheel shattered, the dry wood giving way under the strain and the cold. The corner of the wagon slammed into the frozen earth, throwing Maggie from the seat. She landed hard in a snowdrift, the breath driven from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, staring up at the swirling gray sky. Stunned, the pain in her shoulder throbbed, but her first thought, her only thought, was of her belly. She scrambled to her knees, gasping, her hands tearing at the buttons of her coat to press against the layers of fabric over her stomach. "Are you there?" she whispered. The wind snatched the words away. The mare stood a few feet away, shivering, head hanging low, waiting for a command that would not come. The wagon was useless. A broken pile of lumber. Maggie looked around. There was nothing. No lights. No shelter. Just the endless fence line disappearing into the dark and the snow piling up against the posts. She tried to stand, but her legs were trembling so violently she could barely hold her weight. The cold was no longer a stinging sensation. It was a numbing heaviness, a desire to close her eyes and sleep. She stumbled toward the fence, dragging her feet through the drift. She needed to find the lee side of something, anything to break the wind. She collapsed against a cedar fence post, sliding down until she was sitting in the snow, her back to the wood. She curled her knees to her chest, trying to preserve the last of her body warmth. She tucked her chin into her coat. The secret fluttered inside her. It was too early to feel movement. She knew that, but she felt a presence, a tiny spark in the vast, freezing dark. Thomas had called her useless. Alara had called her cursed. They had looked at her body and seen a desert. Maggie slipped her hands inside her coat, pressing them flat against the warmth of her skin, directly over her womb. Tears, hot and fast, tracked down her frozen cheeks. "They will regret losing you," she whispered to the storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the life inside her. It had to be a life. It had to be. "You are not nothing," she hissed, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "You are everything, and I will not let the cold take you. I will not let him take you." But the lethargy was creeping up her limbs. Her toes were numb. Her thoughts began to slow, turning sluggish and thick like molasses. The roar of the wind began to sound like a lullaby. She leaned her head back against the fence post. The snow drifted over her legs, tucking her in. Just for a moment. She thought, "I will rest my eyes just for a moment." Caleb Ward hated the wind. It reminded him of things he had spent 10 years trying to forget. He rode his gelding, a massive roan named Gunpowder, close to the fence line. His hat was pulled low, the brim caked with snow, and his scarf was wrapped up to his nose, leaving only his eyes exposed. They were hard eyes, the color of flint, scanning the wire for breaks. Most men would be indoors with a bottle of whiskey by now. But Caleb knew that a broken fence in a blizzard meant stray cattle, and stray cattle meant dead cattle, and he could not afford to lose a single head. He had built his small herd up from nothing, fighting drought, wolves, and the disdain of the big ranchers like Hale, who thought the open range belonged to them by divine right. He checked the tension on a strand of barbed wire with a gloved hand. It held. "Let us get home, boy," he muttered to the horse. The words were swallowed by the gale. He turned Gunpowder back toward the south, toward the small cabin tucked in the embrace of the foothills 3 miles away. The snow was falling straight down now, heavy and blinding. He almost missed it. It was a shape that didn't belong, a geometric angle in a world of soft curves. Caleb pulled the reins, squinting, 10 yards ahead. A dark lump broke the line of the white earth. A wagon, broken down. He urged the horse forward, his hand instinctively drifting to the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. Trouble came in many forms out here, and an abandoned wagon could be a trap. But as he drew closer, he saw the old mare standing motionless, snow piling on her back. And then he saw the pile of blue wool against the fence post. "Whoa," Caleb said, sliding from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. He tramped through the knee-deep drift, the snow crunching under his boots. He reached the figure and knelt, brushing the snow away from the face. It was a woman. Her skin was the color of milk, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. Her lashes were frozen together. Caleb swore softly, a harsh sound in the quiet storm. He recognized the wagon now. The paint on the side, though chipped, bore the distinct brand of the Hale Ranch. This was a Hale woman. He hesitated, for a heartbeat, just one selfish, ugly heartbeat. He thought about getting back on his horse. The Hales were poison. Thomas Hale had tried to run Caleb off this land 2 years ago, cutting his water access and threatening to burn him out. Touching anything that belonged to Thomas Hale brought nothing but misery. If he took her, and she died, they would say he killed her. If she lived, they would say he kidnapped her. But then the woman let out a small, whimpering breath, and her hand, tucked inside her coat, twitched. Caleb looked at her face. She was not the old lady. Ilara, she was younger, fine-boned. He had seen her once or twice in town, from a distance. The wife, the one people whispered about because she walked with her head down and her eyes fixed on the dirt. He saw the way her arms were curled around her midsection, a protective, desperate gesture. Damn it all, Caleb growled. He pulled off his thick glove and pressed his hand to her neck. A pulse, faint, threading. But there, he could not leave a dog out in this, let alone a woman. He scooped his arms under her. She was light, disturbingly so, but dead weight in her unconsciousness. As he lifted her, her coat fell open slightly at the wrist. Caleb froze. Around her slender wrist, stark against the pale skin, were bruises, dark, purple marks in the shape of fingers. He looked at her face again. There was a story here, a bad one. He shifted her weight, pulling her against his chest to share his heat. He noted the slight, almost imperceptible swell of her stomach beneath the layers of wool. He had delivered enough calves to know the look of a female body changing, preparing. "You are in a bad way, ma'am," he murmured. He carried her to gunpowder. Getting her into the saddle was a struggle. He had to hoist her up, swinging his own leg over behind her, so she sat cradled between his thighs and his chest. He wrapped his heavy buffalo hide coat around both of them, cocooning her. He left the wagon. He cut the mare loose and slapped its rump, sending it trotting vaguely toward his own barn, knowing the animal would follow the other horse. "Hold on," Caleb said to the unconscious woman, one arm wrapped tight around her waist to keep her upright. He spurred gunpowder into a trot. The wind screamed louder, angry that its prize had been snatched away. Caleb ducked his head, shielding the woman's face with his shoulder, and rode blindly into the white, trusting his horse to find the way home. The cabin was not much to look at, but it was built of solid pine logs chinked with mud and straw, and it held the heat. Caleb kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the howl of the storm. The silence that followed was ringing and heavy. The only sound was the crackle of the fire he had banked before leaving that morning. He carried the woman to the narrow bunk built against the far wall. He laid her down on the rough wool blanket. The room was dim, lit only by the orange glow of the embers. Caleb lit a kerosene lantern, the flame sputtering before growing steady. He turned back to her. She was shivering now, violent tremors that racked her small frame. That was good. Shivering meant life. He needed to get her warm, fast. "I am going to have to take these wet things off." "Ma'am," he said to the air, feeling the need to announce his intentions, even if she could not hear him. It felt like a violation, touching the wife of a man like Thomas Hale, but wet wool would kill her as sure as the ice. He worked quickly, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He unbuttoned the sodden gray coat. He unlaced her boots, which were stiff with ice, and pulled them off, rubbing her stockinged feet briskly to get the blood moving. He hesitated at the dress. It was damp at the hem and sleeves. He compromised by unbuttoning the high collar to let her breathe and piling 3 heavy quilts on top of her until she was buried beneath a mountain of wool and fur. He went to the cast-iron stove and stoked the fire, throwing in split logs until the flames roared up the chimney. He filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. Then he sat in the wooden chair by the fire, watching her. He took off his hat, shaking the melting snow onto the floor. A jagged white scar ran from his left temple down to his jawbone, pulling the corner of his eye slightly. It gave him a perpetual look of skepticism. He watched the woman's face. The color was slowly returning, a faint flush touching her cheeks. She looked young, too young to have eyes as sad as the ones he remembered seeing in town. "Who threw you away?" Caleb wondered aloud. "And why did you have bruises on you before the snow even touched you?" An hour passed. The storm outside intensified. shaking the sturdy cabin door on its hinges. A moan from the bunk broke the silence. Caleb stood up and moved closer. Keeping his hands in plain sight, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were green, clouded with confusion. She stared up at the rough timber beams of the ceiling, then turned her head sharply to look at him. She flinched, shrinking back against the wall, pulling the quilts up to her chin. Her eyes darted around the room, the hanging dried herbs, the rifle on the wall, the scarred man standing over her. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "You are safe. Where? Where am I?" Her voice was a broken rasp. "My cabin," Caleb said. "Found you by the fence line. Your wheel broke." Maggie stared at him. The memories came rushing back. The house, the judgment, the cold, the snow. She looked at the man. He was huge, filling the small space. The scar on his face was terrifying in the lantern light. She pressed her hand to her stomach under the quilts. She felt a cramping ache, but no sharp pain, no blood. Still there, still there. "Who are you?" she asked. "Caleb Ward." He said. He waited for her to recognize the name. He waited for the sneer that usually accompanied the realization that she was in the home of the recluse, the man with no family and no past. She blinked. The name seemed to mean nothing to her. "I am Maggie," she said. "Just Maggie?" Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the shame of being Mrs. Hale, the barren wife, the discarded property. If this man knew who she was, he might take her back. He might think he would get a reward for returning her to the ranch that had expelled her. She looked at Caleb's worn shirt, his rough hands, the solitary nature of his existence. He was an outsider, like her, just Maggie. She whispered. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He knew she was lying. He had seen the Hale brand on the wagon. He knew exactly who she was. But he saw the terror in her eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the life she had left behind. "All right, then. Maggie," Caleb said. He turned back to the stove and poured a tin cup of hot water. "Drink this. It will warm your insides." He handed her the cup. She took it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused like old leather, but warm. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb muttered, sitting back down in his chair and stretching his legs out toward the fire. "Storm is bad. Drifts are 5 feet deep against the door already. You are stuck here, Maggie, at least until it breaks." Maggie sipped the hot water, feeling it slide down her throat. She looked at the window, where the snow was pressed tight against the glass, a wall of white sealing them in. She was trapped in a stranger's cabin, with a man who wore violence on his face. She had no money, no home, and a secret growing inside her that could ruin them both. But she was warm. She watched Caleb over the rim of the cup. He was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. A man who seemed carved out of the same hard rock as the mountains. The wind howled outside. A starving beast denied its meal. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. 2 strangers, cast out by the world, sat in the uneasy silence, waiting for the morning. The blizzard did not lift so much as it eventually exhausted itself, like a fever breaking in the night. For 3 days, the world outside the cabin was a formless void of screaming white, the wind hammering against the rough-hewn logs with the force of a physical blow. Inside, the air grew thick with the smell of burning pine, damp wool, and the unspoken tension between 2 strangers trapped in a space no larger than a jail cell. Caleb Ward was a man built for silence. He moved through the small cabin with an economy of motion that spoke of years living alone. He would stoke the cast-iron stove, check the lantern oil, and sharpen his skinning knife by the firelight, his eyes rarely lifting from his task. When he did speak, the words were short, clipped things, tossed out only when necessary. "More wood," he would say, rising to pull a log from the stack by the door. Or, "Stew is hot. Eat." Maggie sat on the edge of the narrow bunk, her hands folded in her lap. The first day, she had been too weak to do much but sleep. the exhaustion of the cold and the trauma of her expulsion weighing her down like wet sand. But by the second day, the shame began to itch at her skin. She was eating this man's food. She was occupying his bed while he slept on a pile of furs on the floor. She was a burden, just as Alara Hale had said she was. Useless. The word echoed in her mind with the rhythm of the wind. Useless. Useless. She watched Caleb as he worked. He was a terrifying figure in the dim light. The scar that ran down the left side of his face pulled at his eye, giving him a permanent expression of grim skepticism. When he moved his right shoulder, he did so with a subtle hitch, a stiffness that suggested old bones badly knit. Violence had written its name on him long ago. On the morning of the third day, the shame became unbearable. Maggie stood up, her legs feeling steady for the first time. She smoothed the wrinkles from her gray wool dress, which she had slept in, and looked for something, anything, to justify her existence. She saw the floor, covered in the debris of the storm, bits of bark from the firewood, dried mud from Caleb's boots, dust unsettled by the draft. She found a broom made of tied straw in the corner and began to sweep. Caleb looked up from where he was oiling a bridle at the small table. He watched her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You should sit," he said. "You are still pale." "I have sat for 2 days," Maggie replied, not looking at him. Her voice sounded rusty to her own ears. "I cannot just sit while you work." Caleb grunted and returned to the leather in his hands. He did not stop her. The sweeping gave her a focus. She moved the dust from the corners to the hearth, her movements rhythmic. But the exertion brought a sudden, dizzying wave of heat. Her stomach lurched, a sour, watery sensation rising in her throat. She stopped, gripping the handle of the broom, her knuckles white. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the nausea. "Not here. Do not be sick here." She felt the waistband of her dress cutting into her. It was not tight. She was slender, almost gaunt from stress, but the pressure against her abdomen felt unbearable. "Are you all right?" Caleb's voice was closer than she expected. She opened her eyes to find him standing a few feet away, watching her intently. "I am fine," Maggie lied, forcing a swallow. "Just dizzy. The heat of the fire." "Sit," Caleb commanded. He took the broom from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, rough and callous, sending a jolt of strange awareness through her. He did not wait for her to argue. He pointed to the chair at the table. Maggie sat. She watched him finish the sweeping, his movement stiff but efficient. She subtly reached down and unhooked the top button of her dress's waistband, concealed by the fabric of her bodice. The relief was instant. She looked at his back. He was broad, his flannel shirt strained across his shoulders. "Does it hurt?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could check it. Caleb stopped moving. He did not turn around. "Does what hurt? Your shoulder," Maggie said softly. "You favor it." Caleb resumed sweeping, the sound of straw on wood filling the silence. "Old break," he said flatly. "Horse threw me, long time ago." It was a lie. Maggie had grown up on ranches. She knew the difference between the clean break of a fall and the shattered grinding of something more malicious. But she recognized the tone. It was the same tone Thomas used when he told people she was unwell, to explain her absence from church after a beating. It was the tone of a door being slammed shut. She did not ask again. Later that afternoon, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of his spare shirt hanging on a peg. Without asking, she took a small sewing kit from her pocket, one of the few things she had grabbed before leaving the Hale ranch, and began to mend it. Caleb watched her from the doorway, where he was checking the snow depth. He seemed about to object, to tell her to leave his things alone, but he stopped. He watched the way her small hands maneuvered the needle, precise and practiced. "You have a steady hand," he noted. "A ranch wife learns to mend," Maggie said, keeping her eyes on the thread. "Or she learns to live with rags." She regretted the words as soon as they left her mouth. Ranch wife. She was no longer a wife. She was nothing. Caleb turned back to the snow. "Storm is breaking," he said. "By tomorrow, I can get the wagon through to town." Maggie's hand slipped. The needle pricked her finger. a tiny bead of bright red blood blooming on her skin. "Town," she whispered. "You cannot stay here." "Maggie," Caleb said, his back to her, "this is no place for a woman. It is barely a place for a man. You need a boarding house, a warm room, decent food." Maggie stared at the blood on her finger. She thought of Oakhaven. She thought of the way the women in the general store fell silent when she walked in. She thought of the whispers. "There goes the Baron Hale woman, the one who couldn't keep a baby. Now, without Thomas's name and money to shield her, what would they say?" "I suppose so," she said, her voice hollow. The morning broke with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. The sun reflected off miles of virgin snow, turning the world into a blinding sheet of diamond dust. The sky was a hard, polished blue, stripped clean of clouds. Caleb hitched Gunpowder and the mare, who had recovered enough to pull, to his buckboard wagon. He had shoveled a path from the barn, his breath pluming in the frigid air like smoke from a train engine. Maggie walked out of the cabin wearing her coat and scarf. The cold hit her instantly, sharp and invigorating, but it also brought a knot of dread to her stomach. Every turn of the wagon wheel would take her closer to a world that had already rejected her. Caleb helped her up to the seat. His grip was firm, impersonal. He did not look her in the eye. He climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels crunching loudly on the frozen crust of the snow. The ride to Oakhaven took 3 hours. The road was buried, forcing Caleb to navigate by the line of telegraph poles and the shape of the land. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the jingle of the harness and the snort of the horses. Maggie clutched the side of the seat, every bump sending a shock through her spine. She worried for the life inside her. "Hold on," she whispered silently. "Just hold on." When the town came into view, Maggie felt a physical urge to jump from the wagon and run back into the wilderness. Oakhaven was a collection of 50 or so buildings huddled against the wind. A general store, a livery stable, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, and a few scattered houses. Caleb drove the wagon down the main street. The snow had been packed down by other travelers, turning the road into a slurry of brown slush. People were out, digging out walkways and clearing roofs. As the wagon passed, heads turned. Maggie lowered her chin, burying her face in her scarf, but she could feel their eyes. "That is Ward's wagon," she heard a man say from the boardwalk. "Who is that with him? Looks like a woman." Caleb ignored them, staring straight ahead, his jaw set like granite. He pulled the wagon up in front of the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building with a sign that read, "Mrs. Higgins's rooms and board." "You wait here," Caleb said. "I will see if she has space." He jumped down and went inside. Maggie sat alone on the wagon seat, exposed. 2 women in heavy woolen shawls walked out of the general store across the street. They stopped, staring at Maggie. One of them whispered something, and the other gasped, her hand going to her mouth. Is that Mrs. Hale?" the second woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "It looks like her, but what is she doing on Caleb Ward's wagon? I heard Thomas put her out. I heard she was afflicted." Maggie stared at the horse's ears, her face burning. Afflicted, as if her grief were a contagion. The door to the boarding house opened, and Caleb came out. His face was dark, his brow furrowed in anger. "Mrs." Higgins stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Maggie with cold, hard eyes. "I run a respectable house. Mr. Ward, Mrs." Higgins said, her voice loud enough to carry across the street. "I do not take in women with no luggage and no husband, arriving on the wagon of a bachelor. She needs a room for a few nights," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "She has money." "References, Mrs.?" Higgins asked, raising an eyebrow. "Does she have a letter from her husband?" Caleb said nothing. He knew, and Mrs. Higgins knew, that there was no letter. "I did not think so." "Mrs." Higgins said, crossing her arms. "Try the saloon. They are less particular about their guests." She slammed the door. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the wood. His fists were clenched at his sides. He turned and walked back to the wagon, climbing up slowly. He did not look at Maggie. He did not have to. The humiliation hung in the air between them, thick and choking. "I need supplies," Caleb said roughly. "General store." He drove the wagon across the street. "Maggie, wait," he started, but she shook her head. I need to see the doctor," she said quietly. Caleb looked at her, surprised. "Are you sick?" Maggie hesitated. "Just the cold. I need a tonic." Caleb nodded. "The doctor's office is next to the livery. I will handle the supplies." Maggie climbed down. Her legs felt weak. She walked down the boardwalk, keeping her head down, ignoring the whispers that trailed her like a wake. "Doctor." Finch was an older man with spectacles and hands that smelled of rubbing alcohol and peppermint. His office was warm, cluttered with books and jars of strange powders. He looked at Maggie as she sat on the examination table, her face pale and drawn. "Mrs. Hale, isn't it?" "Doctor," Finch asked gently. "Just Maggie. She said, please, just Maggie." "Very well. Maggie, what brings you?" She told him. The missed cycles, the nausea, the fatigue, the dull ache in her back. "Doctor," Finch asked a few questions, his voice low and professional. He checked her eyes, felt her pulse, and gently pressed on her abdomen through her dress. He stepped back and wiped his hands on a towel. "Well, Maggie," he said, peering at her over his spectacles. "It seems fairly clear. You are with child." The words hung in the warm air. "With child." Maggie let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. A sob caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" she whispered. I have lost them before. 3 times. Doctor." Finch's expression softened into pity. "I know. I treated you after the second one. Your body is strong, Maggie, but it is tired. You are perhaps 2 months along. The danger period is not over." He leaned forward. "Listen to me closely. You cannot be riding in wagons over rough ground. You cannot be lifting heavy loads. You need rest. You need food. And you need peace of mind. Stress is a poison to a pregnancy as fragile as this." "Rest," Maggie repeated, a bitter laugh bubbling up. "I have nowhere to go. Doctor, I have no home. Doctor." Finch frowned. "What about Thomas?" Maggie looked at the floor. "Thomas does not want it. Or me." The doctor was silent for a long time. The cruelty of the world was no stranger to him. But this was a particularly sharp blade. "You must find a way. Maggie, for the child's sake. If you stay out in the cold, or if you work yourself to the bone, you will lose this one too." Maggie nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I will try." She paid him with 2 of the dollars from her pocket, a fortune, and walked back out into the cold. The wind felt different now. It was no longer just an enemy. It was a threat to something specific, something real. She placed a hand over her coat, shielding the tiny life. "I will not let you go." When she returned to the wagon, Caleb was loading sacks of flour and coffee. He was moving with an agitated energy, throwing the heavy sacks into the bed with unnecessary force. He paused when he saw her. He looked at her face, seeing the tear tracks she hadn't managed to hide. "You okay?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "I am fine. Climb up." As Caleb walked around to the other side of the wagon, 2 men came out of the saloon nearby. They were ranch hands from the Double Bar Ranch, loud and smelling of beer. "Hey, Ward," one of them shouted. "Heard you picked up Hale's trash." The other man laughed. "Careful. Caleb, if she is too broken for Thomas Hale, she is surely too much for a dirt scratcher like you." Caleb stopped. He turned slowly to face them. His hand drifted toward his hip, where a Colt revolver rested. "Say another word," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried across the street like a crack of thunder. "And I will bury you where you stand." The men fell silent. They knew the stories about Caleb Ward's face. They knew he had survived things that killed other men. They muttered something and hurried away. Caleb climbed into the wagon. He did not mention the men. He did not look at Maggie. He snapped the reins, and they drove out of town, leaving the eyes and the whispers behind. The ride back was quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer just awkward. It was heavy with the weight of shared knowledge. Caleb knew who she was. He had heard the men, "Hale's trash." Maggie sat stiffly, the doctor's warning ringing in her ears. Rest, no rough riding. Every jolt of the wagon felt like a betrayal of her baby. They were halfway back to the cabin, the sun beginning to dip toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. When Caleb finally spoke, "They won't take you," he said. "The boarding house." "No," Maggie said. "They won't. And you have no family out here?" "No." Caleb watched the road, his eyes squinting against the glare. He chewed on the inside of his cheek. He was a man who valued his solitude above all else. He liked the silence of his cabin. He liked having only the cattle to worry about. A woman, especially this woman, with her baggage and her high society husband, was a complication he did not need. But he thought of Mrs. Higgins closing the door. He thought of the men laughing. He thought of the bruises on Maggie's wrists that were just now fading to yellow. And he thought of the way the cabin had smelled that morning, like coffee and swept floors, not just stale smoke and loneliness. "I need help with the stock," Caleb said suddenly. Maggie looked at him. "What? Winter is hard," he continued, staring steadfastly at the horse's ears. "I lose time cooking and washing. I lose calves because I'm stuck at the stove or mending my own damn shirts." He paused, shifting the reins in his hands. "You can stay. Through the winter. You cook, you keep the house, you help with the chickens and the garden when the thaw comes. I will pay you wages. $3 a month and board. Come spring, you will have enough saved to catch the stagecoach west, maybe California, start fresh." Maggie stared at him. It was a business arrangement. He was offering her a job, not charity. He was giving her a way to keep her dignity. But she knew what it meant. A woman living alone with a man who was not her husband. It would confirm every nasty rumor in town. It would ruin her reputation forever. Then she felt the faint cramp in her belly. She remembered Dr. Finch's face. "You need a roof. You need food." If she said no, where would she go? To the snow? To starve? She looked at Caleb. He was rough, scarred, and guarded. But he had pulled her out of the snow. He had stood up to the men in town. He had offered her a job instead of a handout. "I can cook," Maggie said softly, "and I can handle chickens." "It is not a charity," Caleb said firmly. "You will work. I am not afraid of work. Mr. Ward." "Caleb," he said, "if we are to be living under one roof, you best call me Caleb." Maggie looked out at the vast, empty plains. She was an outcast. She was a fallen woman, but she was alive. "I accept. Caleb." Life at the cabin settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the cold. Maggie took over the interior of the small log house. She scrubbed the floors with sand and water until the wood pale. She organized Caleb's chaotic pantry, lining up the tins of beans and sacks of flour. She learned to cook on the temperamental cast-iron stove, making hearty stews from dried beef and root vegetables, and baking biscuits that were heavy but warm. She worked hard, but she was careful. When Caleb was out on the range, she moved slowly. She rested when the dizziness came. She drank water constantly. She loosened her corset stays until they provided support without constriction. The physical work was demanding. Hauling water from the creek involved breaking the ice with a hatchet every morning. The bucket was heavy, straining her arms and back. Feeding the chickens meant wading through drifts that soaked the hem of her dress. But there was a peace in the labor. It was honest. Unlike the idle days at the Hale Ranch, where her only job was to be decorative and fertile, here her survival depended on her hands. Caleb was true to his word. He treated her with a gruff, distant respect. He ate her food with appreciation, though he rarely praised it. He slept on the floor, giving her the bunk, until he fashioned a makeshift cot in the corner behind a hung blanket for privacy. He watched her, though. He watched the way she sometimes paused with her hand on her back. He watched the way she turned pale when he fried salt pork. He suspected, but he said nothing. It was not his place. The landscape was a constant, looming presence. The cold was a living thing that sought to find cracks in the chinking. At night, the wolves howled from the ridges, a mournful, hungry sound that made Maggie shiver and pull the quilts tighter. One evening in mid-December, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of fresh snow. Caleb had ridden out early to check on a group of heifers that had strayed into a box canyon. He said he would be back by dusk. Dusk came, and he did not return. Darkness fell, absolute and suffocating. Maggie paced the small cabin. She checked the stove. She checked the window. All she could see was her own reflection in the swirling snow. Hours passed. The wind began to shriek, rattling the door. Fear, cold and sharp, took root in her chest. Not just fear for herself, though she knew she could not survive out here alone, but fear for him. He was the only thing standing between her and the void. But more than that, she had grown used to the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the smell of tobacco and leather that clung to him. She had grown used to the quiet safety of his presence. If he was dead, panic overtook her. She grabbed her shawl and threw open the door. "Caleb," she screamed into the dark. The wind tore the name from her lips. She stepped out onto the porch, the snow biting her bare feet. She didn't feel it. She ran a few steps into the yard, scanning the tree line. Caleb! A shape emerged from the swirling white. A horse, gunpowder, plodding through the drifts, head down, and slumped in the saddle. A figure. Maggie's heart stopped. Then the figure sat up. Caleb swung his leg over and dropped to the ground, landing heavily. He led the horse toward the barn. He was alive. Maggie let out a sob of relief so violent it hurt her ribs. She ran toward him, heedless of the snow, heedless of her lack of boots. "Caleb," he turned, startled. He saw her running toward him in the dark, barefoot, her hair wild in the wind. "Maggie," he barked. "What in God's name?" He dropped the reins and caught her as she stumbled into him. Her hands gripped the rough wool of his coat, clutching him as if he were a lifeline. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I thought you were dead," she choked out. "The wolves, the storm." Caleb stood frozen, his arms hovering uncertainly around her. He felt the heat of her body, the frantic beating of her heart against his chest. He looked down at her face, illuminated by the spill of light from the open cabin door. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that was entirely for him. No one had ever looked at him like that. No one had ever waited for him. No one had ever cared if Caleb Ward came home from the range or froze to death in a ditch. The realization hit him harder than the cold. He tightened his grip, his large hands encompassing her shoulders. "I am here," he said, his voice gruff but thick with something new. "I am here. Maggie." He looked down at her feet. "You are barefoot, woman," he scolded, though there was no heat in it. "You will lose your toes. Get inside." He scooped her up, just as he had that first night, and carried her back into the cabin. He set her down by the fire and knelt to rub her frozen feet with a rough towel. Maggie sat shivering, watching him. The fear was fading, replaced by a sudden, intense awareness of his hands on her skin, the proximity of his face, the smell of the cold clinging to his clothes. Their eyes met. For a second, the air in the room was not cold. It was charged, electric. Maggie saw the loneliness in his eyes, a mirror of her own. She saw the man beneath the scar, and Caleb saw the fire in her, the fierce loyalty of a woman who had been discarded but refused to break. A longing, sharp and dangerous, passed between them. It was not just gratitude. It was a hunger to be known, to be held. Caleb cleared his throat and stood up abruptly, breaking the connection. "I need to tend the horse," he said, his voice tight. "Go to sleep, Maggie." He walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. Maggie sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the sounds of him working in the barn. Her heart was still racing, but the panic was gone, replaced by a warm, glowing ember of hope. Later, in the dark of the cabin, she lay in her bunk. She could hear Caleb's steady breathing from his cot across the room. The wind howled outside, scratching at the walls, but it could not get in. Slowly, cautiously, Maggie slid her hand under the heavy quilts. She pressed her palm against her lower belly. It was still flat, but the skin felt firm, warm. She closed her eyes. "We are safe," she whispered in the darkness, so softly that only the baby could hear. "We will survive this winter. Little one, he will not let the cold take us." Outside, the blizzard raged, but inside, the first fragile roots of a new life had begun to take hold. The transition from winter to spring on the Wyoming range was not a gentle awakening, but a violent unearthing. The snow, which had entombed the cabin for months, did not simply melt. It collapsed into a sodden, weeping mess that turned the hard-packed earth into a quagmire of sucking gray mud. The creek, once a frozen ribbon of silence, roared back to life, swollen with meltwater from the high peaks. It tore at its banks, brown and angry, carrying driftwood and debris that battered against the rocks like battering rams. The air lost its bite but gained a damp, penetrating chill that settled into the bones more deeply than the dry freeze of January ever had. For Maggie, the spring brought a new and terrifying urgency. She stood by the wash basin in the dim light of the early morning, the sun just beginning to bleed gray across the eastern horizon. She held a damp rag to her face, fighting the wave of nausea that had become her constant companion. It was worse now. The sickness did not fade with the morning, but lingered like a ghost, haunting her through the afternoon chores. She looked down at her dress. It was the same gray wool she had worn since the night she was cast out, but it no longer hung loosely on her frame. The fabric pulled tight across her midsection. Her waist, once slender enough for Thomas to span with his hands, a feat he used to perform with possessive pride, had thickened. She had spent the last 3 nights by the dying fire, after Caleb had gone to sleep, secretly picking out the side seams of the bodice and sewing them back with less allowance, stealing an inch here, an inch there. But she was running out of fabric. Maggie smoothed the dress down, her hands trembling. "If he sees," she whispered to herself, the sound of her voice lost under the roar of the rushing creek outside. "If he sees, he will know. And if he knows, he will put me out." She had convinced herself of this. Caleb Ward was a decent man, yes, he had saved her life. He had given her wages and a roof. But he was a man of the frontier, hard and practical. Why would he shelter a woman carrying another man's child? A child that belonged to the enemy who had tried to ruin him. To Caleb, her swelling belly would be proof of her baggage, a complication he could not afford. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch. Maggie quickly splashed water on her face, pinching her cheeks to hide the pallor, and turned just as the door opened. Caleb entered, bringing the smell of wet earth and wet horse with him. He looked tired. The calving season had begun, and the mud made every task a battle. His boots were caked to the ankles in sludge. "Coffee is ready," Maggie said, moving to the stove. She kept her back to him, shielding her profile. Caleb grunted his thanks. He walked to the table and sat heavily, wincing as he moved his bad shoulder. The damp weather made the old injury sing with pain, though he never complained. Maggie poured the coffee into a tin cup and set it before him. She placed a plate of biscuits and salted beef on the table. "You are not eating?" Caleb asked, looking at the single plate. "I ate while you were out." She lied. She had not eaten. The thought of the greasy beef made her stomach roll. Caleb looked at her. His dark eyes, usually guarded, lingered on her face. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she set down the pot. He saw more than she realized. "Sit," he said. "I have to feed the chickens," Maggie said, turning away. "The chickens can wait," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "Sit down, Maggie." She hesitated, then pulled out the chair opposite him. She sat on the edge of the seat, her posture rigid, trying to hold her stomach in. Caleb pushed the plate toward her. "Eat," he said. "You are getting thin in the face. A wind like this will blow you away if you do not put some meat on your bones." "I am not hungry." "Caleb, eat half." Then, he did not look away until she picked up a biscuit. She took a small bite, the dry bread turning to paste in her mouth, but she forced it down. Caleb watched her for a moment longer, then turned his attention to his food. "River is high," he said between bites. "We lost a calf last night. Swept downstream before I could get a rope on it." Maggie looked up, genuine sympathy breaking through her anxiety. "I'm sorry, Caleb," he shrugged. "It happens, but it means I will be out late tonight. I need to move the herd to the high pasture, away from the water. The mud is deep. It will be slow going. I will have a hot stew ready when you return," she promised. Caleb nodded. He finished his coffee and stood up. As he reached for his hat, he paused. "That chair you are sitting in," he said. Maggie looked down. It was the one with the loose leg, the one she always had to balance carefully to keep from tipping. "I fixed the leg yesterday," Caleb said. "Used a bit of rawhide and a fresh dowel. It should hold your weight better now." Maggie blinked. She shifted her weight. The chair was solid, rock steady. She looked at him, surprised. He had done it without a word. No demand for thanks, no pointing it out until now. "Thank you," she said softly. He pulled his hat low. "Don't mention it, just be careful on the ice by the trough. It is slick." He walked out, the door latch clicking shut behind him. Maggie sat in the sturdy chair, staring at the closed door. She touched the wood of the table, a small kindness, a fixed chair, a pushed plate. She pressed her hand to her belly, the fabric straining against her palm. "He sees me," she thought. "He sees me, and yet he does not see this." The weeks dragged on, bleeding into April. The mud hardened into ruts that could snap a horse's leg, only to turn back to soup with the next rain. The tension in the cabin grew, but it was not the tension of hostility. It was a strange, silent weaving of lives. Caleb continued to surprise her. One evening, Maggie returned from the coop to find a second wool blanket folded neatly at the foot of her bunk. It was one of his, a heavy army-issue blanket he usually kept on his cot. The nights were still freezing, and he had noticed her shivering in her sleep. Another night, he brought in a handful of early crocus flowers, crushed and muddy from his saddlebag, and put them in a jar on the table. "I found them on the south ridge," he muttered when he saw her looking at them. Seemed a waste to let the cows trample them. He did not say they were for her. He did not have to. Maggie tried to repay him in the only ways she could. She mended his clothes until they looked new. She learned to bake bread with a sourdough starter she made herself, producing loaves that were light and sour and crusty, unlike the hardtack he was used to. But the secret grew. She could feel the baby moving now. It started as a flutter, like a moth trapped in her hands, and grew into distinct, rolling turns. Every movement was a joy and a terror. She began to wear her shawl even inside the house, draping it over her front to hide her silhouette. She turned her back when she felt a wave of sickness. She insisted she was just tired when he tried to lift a grain sack for her, snatching it up before he could help, terrified he would feel the hardness of her belly if he brushed against her. It came to a head on a night when the sky turned black as pitch and a spring thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, shaking the cabin to its foundation. Maggie went to sleep early, exhausted by a day of scrubbing laundry. She fell into a deep, restless slumber. The dream came quickly. She was back in the big house at the Hale Ranch. But the house was not right. The walls were bleeding. The floor was covered in shattered glass. Thomas stood at the top of the stairs. He was 10 feet tall, his face a mask of shadow, barren. He whispered. The word echoed like the thunder. Empty, dry, dead. He started to descend the stairs. Maggie tried to run, but her feet were stuck in the mud of the hallway. "You kill them!" Thomas screamed, his voice changing, becoming a roar. "You take my heirs and you turn them to dust." He reached her. He grabbed her shoulders. His hands were burning hot. "Get out," he shouted. "Get out before you kill everything I own." He shoved her. She fell backward, falling into the dark. "No!" Maggie screamed. She woke with a violent jolt. She was on the floor of the cabin. She had fallen from the narrow bunk in her thrashing. The room was lit by a flash of lightning. followed by a crack of thunder that sounded like the world ending. Maggie scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough stones of the hearth. She was gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Thomas!" she cried out, not knowing where she was. "Don't! Maggie!" Strong hands gripped her arms. She flinched, letting out a sharp cry of terror, throwing her hands up to protect her face. "Easy, it is me. It is Caleb." The voice cut through the panic. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the dying fire. Caleb was kneeling in front of her. He was wearing his long underwear, his hair mussed from sleep. His face was etched with concern, the scar standing out white against his skin. "Maggie," he said gently. "You were screaming." Maggie stared at him, her chest heaving. The reality of the cabin rushed back, the smell of pine, the sound of the rain, the safety. She slumped forward, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. She began to shake, violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled her teeth. I am sorry," she stuttered. "I had a dream." Caleb did not let go of her arms. His grip was warm and solid. "It sounded like more than a dream," he said softly. He shifted, sitting back on his heels, but he did not move away. He reached out and pulled the quilt from the bunk, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Come here," he said. "You are freezing." He pulled her closer to the warmth of the embers. Maggie allowed herself to be moved. She felt small and broken. The nightmare still clung to her. Thomas's voice, the accusation, "You kill them." A sob ripped from her throat. She tried to stifle it, clamping her hand over her mouth, but another followed, and then another. The dam broke. She wept. She wept for the 5 years of silence. She wept for the tiny lives that had slipped away before they could breathe. She wept for the cruelty of a man she had once promised to love. Caleb sat beside her. He did not shush her. He did not tell her to stop. He simply wrapped a heavy arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side. He felt stiff at first, unsure, but as she leaned into him, burying her face in the rough flannel of his shirt, he relaxed. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "Let it out," he murmured. "Let it all out. Maggie." It took a long time for the tears to subside. When they did, Maggie felt hollowed out, empty but clear. She remained leaning against him, staring into the red glow of the coals. The storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic rain. "I married him when I was 18, she said. Her voice was a whisper, rough with crying. Caleb did not speak. He waited. He was handsome and rich. My father thought it was a blessing. The Hales own half the valley. She pulled the quilt tighter. I wanted children. Caleb, more than anything. I wanted a house full of noise. She swallowed hard. The first one. I lost it at 3 months. I fell on the ice. Thomas was angry, but he said we would try again. The second one. It just stopped. No reason. Just stopped. She felt Caleb's arm tighten around her. That was when the anger started. She continued, he stopped looking at me. He stopped touching me, except to do his duty. He told his mother I was weak, that my soil was bad. Caleb's jaw clenched. He stared at the fire, a muscle jumping in his cheek. The third time, Maggie's voice broke. The third time, the doctor came. Dr. Finch. He was kind. He took Thomas into the study. I listened at the door. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes red and swollen. The doctor told Thomas that it might not be me. He said that Thomas had the fever when he was a boy. Mumps. He said it can spoil a man's seed, make it weak, that even if a babe is made, it might not grow. Caleb turned his head to look at her, his eyes widening slightly. Thomas knew, he asked, his voice a low growl. He knew. Maggie nodded. He knew it was likely him. But he came out of that room, and he looked at me, and he told me I was barren. He told his parents I was cursed. He let the whole town believe I was a dry husk, useless and broken, because Thomas Hale could not bear to be the one who was flawed. The silence in the cabin was heavy, charged with a sudden, violent energy. Caleb looked at the fire. His hands were curled into fists on his knees. The rage that radiated off him was palpable. It was not the explosive, shouting rage of Thomas. It was a cold, deadly thing. The rage of a man who despises injustice. "He let you carry that," Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He let you carry that shame to save his own pride. He made me hate my own body," Maggie whispered. She took a deep breath. She had to finish it. She had to tell him everything. She pulled away from him slightly, creating a space between them. She needed him to see her, to see all of her. She let the shawl fall open. She let the quilt slip down. She took Caleb's hand. It was large, scarred, and rough. She guided it, not to her waist, but to the air just inches above the swell of her stomach. Caleb froze. He looked down. In the firelight, the curve was undeniable. The tight wool of her dress strained against a life that was demanding to be seen. "I did not tell him," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "When the sickness came this time, I hid it. I was terrified. Caleb, if I told him, and if I lost this one too, I thought he might kill me. Or worse, he might watch me with those cold eyes and wait for me to fail." She looked at his hand, hovering near her. "So when he cast me out, when he gave me $50 and told me to leave, I took his air with me." She looked up at his face, bracing herself for the rejection. She expected anger. She expected him to pull his hand away as if she were unclean. She expected him to tell her to pack her things. Caleb stared at her belly. He did not pull away. His breathing hitched. He turned his hand over, palm up, hovering just an inch from the fabric. He looked at it with a kind of reverence, as if he were looking at a burning bush or a holy relic. "He put you in a wagon," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In a blizzard, knowing you were carrying a child. He didn't know." Maggie said, "I didn't tell him. But you are a woman," Caleb said, his eyes lifting to hers. "You are small. The wind alone could have killed you, and he threw you away like trash." He slowly, very slowly, closed the distance. He did not touch her stomach. He seemed to understand that her body had been a battleground, a place of pain and invasion, but he rested his hand on her knee, grounding her. "This is not a curse, Maggie," he said firmly. He looked deep into her eyes. "A child is life. It is a miracle. It does not matter who the father is. It matters that it is here, and that you fought for it." Maggie felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. You are not angry," she whispered, "that I brought this trouble to your door?" "Trouble?" Caleb shook his head. He looked at her with a fierce, protective intensity. "Thomas Hale is a fool. A blind, cruel fool. He threw away a diamond because he was too weak to polish it." Tears spilled over Maggie's cheeks again. But they were different now. They were tears of relief, of a burden being lifted that she hadn't realized was crushing her spine. "He sees me," she thought. "He truly sees me." The air between them shifted. The shared pain, the confession, the raw honesty. It stripped away the layers of politeness and employer-employee distance. They were just a man and a woman, alone in the dark, bound by the storm and the truth. Caleb looked at her face, at the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, at her trembling lips. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. The hunger in his expression was naked and startling. It was not the greedy, possessive hunger of Thomas. It was a hunger for connection, a hunger for softness in a hard world. Maggie felt her own breath hitch. Her heart began to race, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming need. She wanted to be held, not for comfort, but for this, to be wanted, to be desired, despite her scars, despite her swollen belly, despite her shame. "Caleb," she breathed. He leaned in. The movement was slow, giving her 1,000 chances to pull away. She did not pull away. She leaned forward to meet him. Their lips met. It was tentative at first, a question asked in the dark. Caleb's lips were chapped, tasting of coffee and the salt of her tears. But when Maggie let out a soft sigh and pressed closer, the kiss deepened. It became desperate. Caleb's hand moved from her knee to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Maggie's hands found the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric, pulling him to her. It was a collision of lonely souls. It was the heat of the fire and the storm outside and the months of stolen glances all pouring into one moment. For a minute, the world dissolved. There was only the heat of his mouth, the strength of his arm around her, the feeling of being alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. Then, Caleb stiffened. He pulled back, gasping, as if coming up for air. He scrambled backward, putting 3 feet of distance between them on the hearth rug. His chest was heaving. He looked at her, his eyes wide, his pupils blown black. I cannot, he stammered. Maggie sat frozen, her lips still tingling, her body humming with a rejected energy. She felt a flush of shame rise up her neck. I am sorry, she whispered, pulling the quilt tight around herself again. I should not have. No, Caleb said sharply. He ran a hand through his hair. Agitated. No, Maggie, it is not you. He looked at her, and the torture in his eyes was visible. You are vulnerable. You are scared. You have no one else. If I touch you now, if I take you now, I am no better than him. Using you because you have nowhere else to go. He stood up, pacing the small room. You are carrying a child, he said, gesturing vaguely. You are healing. I will not be the man who takes advantage of a woman in your position. I have honor. Maggie, even if I have nothing else. Maggie looked at him. The rejection stung. It felt like a slap. But as she watched him pacing, wrestling with his own desire to protect her virtue, she realized what he was doing. He wanted her. She could see it in the way his hands shook, but he was denying himself because he respected her too much to treat her as a convenience. He was right. And that made her love him, a dangerous, terrifying thought, all the more. Go to sleep, Maggie, Caleb said, his voice rough. I will sleep in the barn tonight. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the rain, leaving her alone by the fire. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a thick, suffocating awkwardness. Caleb came in for breakfast after chores. He did not look at her directly. Maggie moved around the stove with stiff, mechanical movements, but the silence was different. It was not the cold silence of the Hales. It was a vibrating, heavy silence. When he handed her the milk pail, his fingers brushed hers. He did not pull away as quickly as before. He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. I will be working on the south fence today, he said. Be careful, Maggie replied. I always am. The words were simple, but the subtext was loud. I am here. I am not going anywhere. We are in this together. Later that week, the weather cleared enough for a trip to town. They needed flour and nails. Maggie sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat. She did not hide in her scarf this time. She sat upright, her hands resting openly on the curve of her stomach, which was now impossible to hide under her coat. They rode into Oak Haven. The mud in the street was drying into hard, rutted clay. Caleb helped her down in front of the general store. His hand lingered on her waist for a moment, steadying her. It was a possessive gesture, whether he meant it to be or not. As they walked into the store, the bell above the door chimed. The conversation inside stopped. Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, was at the counter. She turned, her eyes widening as they landed on Maggie's midsection. Maggie held her head high. She walked past the woman to the bolts of fabric. Behind the counter stood Mr. Abernathy, the clerk. He was a small, weasel-faced man with greased hair and an ambition that far outstripped his station. He had always fawned over Thomas Hale when the rancher came to town, laughing too loud at his jokes, eager to be noticed by the valley's royalty. Abernathy watched Maggie. He saw the belly. He saw Caleb Ward standing guard near the door, watching everyone who looked at her. Abernathy's eyes narrowed. He did the math. Maggie Hale had been gone for 5 months. She was showing. That meant she was at least 4 or 5 months along. But Hale had cast her out for being barren. A slow, malicious smile spread across Abernathy's face. He rang up their purchases in silence, his eyes darting between Maggie and Caleb. Will that be all? Mr. Ward? Abernathy asked, his voice dripping with false syrup. "That is all," Caleb said. He paid with coins that clinked loudly on the counter. He took the sack of flour and guided Maggie out the door. As soon as the wagon pulled away, rattling down the street toward the open range, "Mr." Abernathy reached under the counter. He pulled out a sheet of paper and a pen. He dipped the nib in the inkwell. He began to write. "To Mr. Thomas Hale, I hope this letter finds you in good health and prosperity. I write to you as a concerned citizen and a friend to your family's good name. It behooves me to inform you of a scandalous sight in Oakhaven this afternoon. Your former wife, Margaret, was seen in the company of the squatter, Caleb Ward. But more importantly, sir, she is quite visibly with child. The town speaks of nothing else. It seems the woman you put aside for her lack of fruitfulness has found a way to bloom in the bed of a no-name cattleman. I thought you should know, for the sake of your reputation. Your humble servant." Arthur Abernathy blotted the ink. He folded the letter and sealed it with a drop of red wax. He walked to the post box at the front of the store just as the afternoon stagecoach pulled up outside, the driver shouting to the horses. Abernathy handed the letter to the driver. "Expressed to the Hale Ranch," he said. The driver nodded. Tossing it into the leather pouch, he cracked his whip, and the stagecoach lurched forward, wheels kicking up dust as it sped east. The sky above the town began to darken, heavy purple clouds rolling in over the mountains. The wind picked up, swirling the dust in the street, far out on the prairie. Maggie sat next to Caleb, watching the sunset, unaware that the ink on a piece of paper was already drying, summoning a storm far worse than any blizzard. The Wyoming summer arrived not with a gentle unfurling of leaves, but with a relentless, baking heat that turned the mud of spring into iron-hard ruts. The grass on the open range shot up green and high, waist-deep in the valleys, rippling like a silk ocean under the wind. But beneath the verdant surface, the earth was thirsty. The creeks were running lower than they should for June, and the old-timers in Oakhaven squinted at the cloudless blue horizon and whispered the word that every rancher feared more than fire or wolves: drought, for Caleb and Maggie. However, the heat brought a different kind of intensity. The days were long, stretching out until the sun dipped behind the peaks in a blaze of violet and gold. The work was endless. With the grass high, the cattle had to be moved, calves branded, and miles of fence line walked and repaired to keep the herd from drifting onto Hale land. Maggie's body had changed. Her belly was now a proud, round curve beneath her calico dress, no longer something to be hidden but a fact of life that she carried with a newfound grace. She tired more easily, her back aching by mid-afternoon, but she refused to be relegated to the rocking chair. One afternoon, under the blazing zenith of the sun, they were working a stretch of fence near the cottonwood grove. Caleb was setting a new cedar post, his shirt soaked through with sweat, the muscles of his back shifting like cords of rope as he tamped the earth down with a heavy iron bar. Maggie was kneeling nearby, sorting nails and holding the wire taut. She watched him, her hand resting absently on her stomach. The baby kicked, a sharp, strong jab against her ribs. "He is active today," she said, wiping a strand of damp hair from her forehead. Caleb paused, leaning on the iron bar. He looked down at her. His face was streaked with dust, the scar white against his tanned skin, but his eyes were soft. "He knows it is hot," Caleb said. "He is protesting the working conditions." Maggie laughed, a sound that came easier these days. She handed him the hammer. "Here, finish it so we can find some shade." Caleb took the hammer. His fingers brushed hers, lingering for a second longer than necessary. The heat of his skin burned hers, a sensation that had nothing to do with the sun. He drove the staple into the wood with 3 clean strikes. As he straightened up, he winced, his hand going to his bad shoulder. "Let me," Maggie said, standing up. She reached up and brushed a dusting of sawdust from his hair. It was an intimate gesture, domestic and tender. Caleb went still. He did not pull away. He stood there, the hammer hanging by his side, breathing in the scent of her, soap and sage and honest sweat. "You work too hard," Maggie whispered, her hand resting on his shoulder. Caleb looked at her mouth. The air between them seemed to shimmer. There is no other way to work. Maggie, he said, his voice rough. Not out here. He turned back to the fence, but the tension remained, pulling tight like the wire between the posts. 2 nights later, the weather broke. The air had been heavy all day, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the lungs. By dusk, the sky to the west had turned a bruised, angry purple. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and continuous, like a heavy wagon rolling over a wooden bridge. They sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the storm gather. The darkness was absolute, save for the flickering flashes of lightning that illuminated the jagged peaks of the mountains. Caleb sat on the steps, whittling a piece of pine. Maggie sat in the chair he had fixed for her, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. The electricity in the air made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up. Or perhaps it was Caleb. He was sitting close enough that she could smell the tobacco in his pocket and the clean scent of the lye soap he had used to wash up at the pump. I used to be afraid of storms, Maggie said quietly. At the big house, the windows would rattle. It felt like the world was trying to get in. And now, Caleb asked, not looking up from his knife. Now I like them, she said. They clear the air. Caleb stopped whittling. He stabbed the knife into the wood of the step and looked out at the lightning. You should go inside. Maggie, when it breaks, the rain will come down hard. I do not want to go inside, she said. I am tired of hiding. The words hung in the thick air. Caleb turned his head slowly to look at her. In the flash of lightning, she saw his eyes. They were dark, hungry, and filled with a terrifying vulnerability. Maggie, he warned, his voice low. Maggie stood up. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, louder than the thunder. She felt huge and clumsy in her pregnancy, yet she also felt powerful. She was creating life. She had survived the winter. She was no longer the frightened girl shivering in a snowdrift. She walked to the edge of the steps and sat down beside him. The wood was warm. I want to belong somewhere. Caleb, she whispered. I want to belong to someone who sees me. Not as a broodmare, not as a mistake, but as me. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at her hands, folded over her belly. You deserve a man who can give you a proper life, he said, not a dirt scratcher with a scarred face and a past full of ghosts. I do not want a proper life, Maggie said fiercely. I had a proper life. It was cold and empty, and it nearly killed me. She reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, twice the size of hers. I want this life, she said. I want the man who pulled me out of the snow. Caleb trembled. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. The restraint he had worn like armor for months finally cracked. I have wanted you, he confessed, his voice breaking. Since the moment you opened your eyes in my bed and looked at me like I was a monster, I wanted to prove to you I wasn't. You are not a monster, Maggie said. You are the best man I have ever known. Caleb let out a ragged breath. He released her hand and reached up to cup her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Are you sure? He asked, searching her eyes. Maggie, are you sure? This complicates everything. I am not a man who takes things lightly. I am sure, she breathed. I choose you. Caleb. The sky opened up. The rain came down in a torrent, a sudden, deafening deluge. But neither of them moved to go inside. Caleb leaned forward and captured her lips. The kiss was not hesitant this time. It was an outpouring of months of suppression. It was hungry and deep, tasting of rain and desperation. Caleb's arms went around her, pulling her close, careful of her stomach but needing to feel the solidity of her against him. Maggie made a sound in her throat, a small cry of need, and buried her hands in his hair. The rain soaked them instantly, plastering their clothes to their skin, but the cold water only made the heat between them burn hotter. Caleb stood up, pulling her with him. He swept her into his arms, carrying her effortlessly across the threshold and into the dim, dry sanctuary of the cabin. He kicked the door shut against the storm. In the darkness, lit only by the sporadic flashes of lightning through the window. He lowered her onto the bunk, not his cot, but the bed she had claimed. He undressed her with trembling hands, treating each button as a revelation. When she lay bare before him, her belly round and pale in the gloom, he did not look away. He knelt beside the bed and kissed the curve of her stomach, his hands resting reverently on her hips. "You are beautiful," he whispered against her skin. Maggie wept, silent tears of relief and joy mixing with the rain on her face. For the first time in her life, she felt worshipped, not assessed. When he joined her in the narrow bed, their union was slow and intense. It was a reclaiming. Maggie took back her body from the memories of duty and pain. Caleb gave up his solitude. They moved together with the rhythm of the storm, seeking shelter in each other, whispering names and promises into the dark. It was an act of defiance. The world had said she was barren. Here she was, full of life. The world had said he was an outcast. Here he was, loved. The morning sun was brilliant, washing the world in gold. The air smelled of wet sage and ozone. Maggie woke first. She lay still, listening to the steady beat of Caleb's heart beneath her ear. His arm was thrown over her waist, heavy and protective. She felt radiant. Her body felt light, despite the weight of the baby. The shame that had dogged her for years, the feeling of being broken, had evaporated in the heat of the night. But as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the floorboards, a sliver of fear returned. What now? They were lovers. She was a married woman in the eyes of the law, carrying a child that belonged to another man by name, living in sin with a cattleman. Caleb stirred. He tightened his arm around her before opening his eyes. He looked down at her, and a slow, sleepy smile spread across his face, softening the harsh lines of his scar. "Morning," he rumbled. "Morning," Maggie whispered. The smile faded slightly as reality set in. Caleb sat up, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked at Maggie, his expression turning serious. "I meant what I said, Maggie, last night. I know." She said, "I will protect you," Caleb vowed, looking at the door as if expecting an enemy to burst through. "You and the little one. No matter what comes, I know," she repeated, "and I'm not afraid." But she was, and as the days passed, the feeling of impending doom grew, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon that refused to break. It happened 3 days later. They were in the garden, weeding the rows of early peas Maggie had planted. The dog, a stray Caleb had adopted in the spring, started barking, a sharp, warning sound. Caleb stood up, shading his eyes against the glare. "Riders," he said. Maggie stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed his gaze. A cloud of dust was moving across the plain, heading straight for their gate. It was not a single rider. It was a group. Caleb reached for the rifle he had taken to leaning against the porch railing. "Go inside. Maggie." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I am done hiding." The riders drew closer. The lead horse was a magnificent black stallion with a silver tack that glinted in the sun. Maggie's blood turned to ice. She knew that horse. The group slowed as they approached the yard. There were 5 of them. Thomas Hale sat on the black stallion. He looked older, heavier, his face florid under his Stetson. Beside him, riding side saddle on a delicate mare, was a woman. She was young, perhaps 20, with pale blonde hair and a riding habit of expensive blue velvet that looked ridiculous in the dust. Behind them rode Silas Hale, Thomas's father, looking grim as death. And flanking them were 2 men Maggie did not know, hired guns, by the look of their low-slung holsters, and Sheriff Miller, a man with a weak chin and a habit of looking the other way when the Hales were involved. Thomas reined in his horse 10 yards from the porch. He looked at Caleb with a sneer of pure contempt. Then his eyes slid to Maggie. He stared at her belly. The shock on his face was genuine, followed instantly by a darkening rage that made him look like a demon. "So," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the yard, "the rumors were true. Get off my land." "Hale," Caleb said, leveling the rifle at Thomas's chest. Thomas ignored the gun. He dismounted, handing the reins to one of the hired men. He helped the young woman down. "Evelyn." "My dear," Thomas said loudly, "this is the woman I told you about, the one who abandoned her vows." Evelyn wrinkled her nose, looking at Maggie's stained apron and the rough cabin. "She looks dreadful." "Thomas." Thomas walked to the fence line, stopping just out of range of a casual swing. "I have come for my wife, Ward, and my heir." Caleb stepped off the porch, placing himself between Thomas and Maggie. "You have no wife here," Caleb said. "You cast her out. In a blizzard. You left her for dead. I did no such thing." Thomas lied smoothly, looking at the sheriff. "She was hysterical. A fit of madness. She ran off. I have been searching for her for months." "Liar!" Maggie screamed. The word ripped from her throat. She stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "You gave me $50 and told me I was barren. You told me to leave before I rotted your house." Thomas looked at her with cold, pitying eyes. He turned to the sheriff. "You see, Sheriff, she is unwell. The pregnancy, it has unhinged her mind. It happens to women of weak constitution." He looked back at Maggie, his eyes landing on her stomach again. A greedy, possessive light entered them. "But God has been merciful. He has granted me a child after all. It is a miracle that my seed took root before she fled." Maggie gasped. The audacity of it took her breath away. He was claiming the baby. The baby he had called a curse. The baby he had believed didn't exist. "It is not your child," Maggie cried. Thomas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "We were married, Margaret. We are still married. The law says that child is mine, and I will not have my heir born in a shack to a whore living with a cripple." Caleb cocked the rifle. The click was loud in the silence. I said, "Get off my land." The sheriff stepped forward, hands raised nervously. "Now, Caleb, put the gun down. Mr. Hale has a legal claim here. If Mrs. Hale is confused, we need to sort this out in town. Before the judge." Thomas smiled, a predator's smile. "Yes, let us go to town. I am sure the good people of Oakhaven would love to hear how you stole my wife and seduced her while she was in a fragile state." He looked at Maggie. "Get your things. Margaret, you are coming home. Evelyn here will see to your needs until the child is born. I will die before I go with you," Maggie hissed. Thomas's face hardened. He walked to the gate, leaning close so only Maggie and Caleb could hear. "If you do not come, Margaret, I will have this man arrested for kidnapping and alienation of affection. I will burn this shack to the ground, and when that baby is born, I will take it anyway, and you will never see it again." Maggie felt the world spin. She grabbed Caleb's arm to steady herself. Caleb looked at Thomas with murder in his eyes. "I will kill you first," Caleb said softly. "And hang for it," Thomas countered. "And leave her alone. Be smart." "Ward." Thomas stepped back, raising his voice again. "We will meet at the sheriff's office in 2 hours to sign the papers. If she is not there, Sheriff Miller will come back with a warrant." He mounted his horse. He looked at Maggie one last time. Not with love, not even with lust, but with the cold satisfaction of a man counting his cattle. 2 hours. "Margaret!" He wheeled the stallion around and galloped away, his entourage following in a cloud of choking dust. The ride to town was a funeral procession. Caleb drove the wagon. The rifle lay across his lap. Maggie sat beside him, dry-eyed and trembling. "He cannot take you," Caleb said for the 10th time. "I won't let him. He has the law." "Caleb," Maggie said, her voice dead. "He has the money. He has the judge. He does not have the truth. Truth does not matter to men like Thomas. Power matters." They arrived in Oakhaven as the sun was high and punishing. The town was buzzing. The Hales' arrival had drawn everyone out. People stood on the boardwalks, watching as Caleb's wagon rolled toward the sheriff's office. They went inside. The office was small, smelling of stale coffee and gun oil. Thomas was already there, sitting in the sheriff's chair as if he owned the place. Silas stood by the window. Evelyn sat on a bench, looking bored, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. The preacher, Reverend Hayes was there too, holding a Bible and looking grave. Maggie walked in, her hand on her stomach. Caleb stood right behind her, a towering shadow. "Sit down." "Margaret," Thomas said. "I will stand," she replied. Thomas shrugged. "Suit yourself." He placed a document on the desk. "I've had my solicitor draw this up. It is a statement. You will sign it. It says that in your grief over your condition, you ran away. That Mr. Ward here took advantage of your distress. That you are returning to your lawful husband to raise our child." "And if I sign?" Maggie asked. "Then Mr. Ward walks away free, no charges. I will even give him $50 for his trouble. And if I don't?" Thomas leaned forward. "Then I accuse him of kidnapping, adultery, theft. He goes to prison. Margaret, for a long time. And I take the child anyway." The room was silent. The fly buzzing against the window pane sounded like a scream. Maggie looked at Caleb. He was looking at her, shaking his head slightly. "Don't do it," his eyes said. "Don't save me." She looked at the preacher. "Reverend," she said, "do you believe in the sanctity of marriage?" "I do, Mrs. Hale," the Reverend said solemnly. "What God has joined." "God did not join us," Maggie said. "A contract did." She turned to Thomas. "You want your heir. Thomas, that is all you want." "It is my right," Thomas snapped. "It is my blood." Maggie took a deep breath. She felt the baby move. A strong kick. Truth. The baby seemed to say, "Give me the truth." She looked at the sheriff. "Sheriff Miller, you were there when Thomas's father passed on the ranch to him?" "I was." The sheriff nodded. "And you know the importance of a bloodline." "Of course." Maggie turned back to Thomas. Her voice was shaking, but it grew stronger with every word. "Then tell them, Thomas, tell them what Dr. Finch told you in the study 3 years ago?" Thomas's face went white. The red flush drained away instantly, leaving him looking like wet dough. "Shut up," he hissed. "Tell them," Maggie shouted. She turned to the room, addressing the crowd that had gathered at the open door. "He calls me barren. He cast me out because I could not give him a child. But it was not me." "Margaret, stop," Thomas roared, standing up. "Dr. Finch told him," Maggie cried, tears streaming down her face. "He had the mumps fever when he was a boy. The doctor told him his seed was weak, that he could likely never father a child." The room gasped. Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide. Silas Hale looked at his son with horror. "He beat me," Maggie sobbed. "Every time I lost a baby, he beat me because he could not stand the truth, that the fault lay in him." She pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. He knows he cannot give his new wife a child. That is why he wants mine, because by some miracle of God, this one survived his poison. He wants to steal the only thing I have because he is empty inside. Liar!" Thomas screamed. He lunged across the desk, his hands reaching for her throat. Caleb moved faster than thought. He caught Thomas by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him back against the wall. The sound of the impact shook the room. "Touch her," Caleb snarled, his face inches from Thomas's, "and I will tear your head off." Thomas struggled, his eyes bulging. "She lies. She is a whore. That brat is probably yours. Then why do you want it so bad?" Caleb yelled. The question hung in the air. Thomas stopped struggling. He looked around the room. He saw the doubt in the sheriff's eyes. He saw the horror on Evelyn's face. He saw the preacher closing his Bible. The mask had cracked. The powerful rancher was gone, replaced by a desperate, impotent man. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, if what she says is true, about the beating, it is a lie," Thomas spat. "We can fetch Dr. Finch," Caleb said coldly. "He is just down the street. We can ask him under oath what he said in that study." Thomas went limp. He knew Finch. The doctor was a man of science and God. He would not lie for money. Thomas shoved Caleb away and straightened his jacket. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He looked at Maggie with a hatred so pure it felt like heat. "You think you have won?" he whispered. "You think shaming me will save you?" He walked to the door, his spurs jingling. He stopped and looked back, his eyes dead and murderous. "The law may not give me the brat now, not with these lies, But the range is a dangerous place. Ward, accidents happen. Fires happen. He looked at Maggie's belly. I will not let a bastard walk around with my name. If I cannot have the child. And no one will. He stormed out, shoving past the stunned townspeople. Silas followed him, head bowed. Evelyn hesitated, looking at Maggie with a mixture of fear and curiosity, before gathering her skirts and rushing after her husband. Maggie sagged against Caleb. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her up. It is not over, Caleb said quietly, watching the empty doorway. No, Maggie whispered, clutching her stomach. It is just beginning. The heat that summer did not just descend on the Wyoming territory. It occupied it like an invading army. By July, the sky had turned a bleached, blinding white, stripped of clouds, and the sun hammered the earth until the ground cracked open in jagged fissures. The wind, usually a nuisance, became a weapon, picking up the dry topsoil and whipping it into choking brown clouds that blotted out the mountains and coated everything in a layer of fine grit. On the open range, the war between Thomas Hale and Caleb Ward turned as ugly as the weather. It started with the fences. Caleb would ride out in the gray light of dawn to find a mile of fresh-strung barbed wire cut, the strands curling back like severed tendons. Then it was the water. The creek that ran through the lower pasture, already low from the drought, was dammed upstream on Hale land, turning Caleb's portion into a muddy trickle where cattle bawled in confusion, their tongues lolling from thirst. Thomas did not hide his hand. He used his wealth like a bludgeon. He hired men from Cheyenne and Laramie, hard-eyed drifters with low-slung holsters who patrolled the borders of his land and rode too close to Caleb's cabin, their silhouettes dark threats against the horizon. Rumors spread through Oak Haven like wildfire in dry brush. Thomas told anyone who would listen in the saloon or on the church steps that Caleb was a rustler, stealing calves to pad his herd. He spoke of Maggie with a poisonous pity, calling her a fallen woman, a whore who had been seduced by a predator and was now living in squalor. Most of the town turned their backs. The shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, suddenly had no flour to sell when Caleb came in. The blacksmith claimed he was too busy to shoe Caleb's horses. Fear of the Hale money and the Hale wrath kept good people silent, but not all. One morning, they found a sack of fresh potatoes and a jar of honey left on their porch before dawn. Another day, Old Man Miller, a neighbor from the North Ridge who had known Caleb for years, rode by and tipped his hat. I saw 3 of Hale's men near your South Gorge, Miller said, staring straight ahead. Just thought you should know. They are carrying Winchesters. Maggie watched it all with a deepening sense of dread, but she refused to cower. She was heavy now. Her belly was a drum-tight mound that led the way wherever she went. Her ankles swelled in the heat, and her back ached with a constant, grinding throb, but she would not sit. Sitting felt like waiting, and waiting felt like dying. She worked. She was up before the sun, kneading dough with swollen fingers, her face dusted with flour and determination. She stood over the hot stove, preserving the few vegetables the garden yielded before the sun scorched them. When Caleb hired 2 local boys, brave enough or desperate enough to ignore Hale's threats, to help with the branding, Maggie cooked for them, serving heaps of beans and cornbread on the porch. You need to rest, Caleb told her one afternoon. He caught her lifting a bucket of water from the pump. He took it from her hand, his eyes angry with worry. I am pregnant. Caleb, not invalid, she snapped, wiping sweat from her forehead with her apron. You are stubborn, he countered. And you are pale. Look at you. You are shaking. I am fine. You are not fine. You are carrying a child in the middle of a war. Sit down, Maggie. That is an order. She glared at him, but she sat. The truth was, she was terrified, not of the work, but of the stillness. If she stopped moving, she would have to think about the gunmen on the ridge. She would have to think about Thomas's promise to take her baby. That night, the fear manifested physically. They had gone to bed early, exhausted by the heat. The wind had died down, leaving a suffocating stillness in the cabin. Maggie woke with a gasp. A pain, sharp and twisting, wrapped around her lower back and squeezed her abdomen. "Caleb," she whispered. He was awake instantly, rolling over to face her. "Maggie, what is it? It hurts," she said, clutching his arm. "Caleb, it hurts." Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Caleb's sleep fog. He sat up, striking a match to light the lantern. In the yellow flare of light, he saw her face. She was white as a sheet, beads of sweat standing out on her upper lip. Is it time?" he asked, his voice tight. "It is too early," Maggie whimpered. "It is only 7 months. Oh, God, Caleb, not again." She curled into a ball, sobbing. The memory of the other 3, the blood, the silence, crashed over her. Caleb moved. He did not hesitate. "Stay here," he said. "Breathe. I am going for Finch." He pulled on his boots and trousers in seconds. He grabbed his revolver, shoving it into his waistband, and ran out the door. The night had turned. A sudden summer storm was brewing, the sky flashing with dry lightning that illuminated the plains in strobe light bursts. Caleb rode gunpowder as if the hounds of hell were snapping at the horse's heels. He pushed the animal hard, galloping through the dark, risking a broken neck in a gopher hole, guided only by the flashes of electricity in the clouds. He reached town in record time, pounding on Dr. Finch's door until the wood nearly splintered. He dragged the old doctor out of bed, threw him into his buggy, and tied gunpowder to the back. "Drive," Caleb ordered, climbing into the buggy seat and seizing the reins. "Or I will drive it off the road." The ride back was a blur of dust and fear. When they burst into the cabin, Maggie was still curled on the bed, gripping the sheets. Dr. Finch went to work, his face grave. He shooed Caleb to the corner. Caleb stood by the hearth, staring into the dark fireplace, listening to Maggie's low moans and the doctor's quiet murmurs. He felt useless. He could fight men. He could fight wolves. He could fight the weather, but he could not fight this. After an hour, the doctor stood up. He wiped his hands on a towel. "The contractions have stopped," Finch said. Caleb let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "Is the baby? The heart is beating," Finch said. "Strong." But this was a warning. Caleb, a severe one. He walked over to Caleb, looking him in the eye. "She is exhausted. Her body is under too much strain. The stress, the heat, the work. It is trying to force the labor early. If the baby comes now, it will not live. The lungs are not ready." Caleb paled. "She needs absolute bed rest," Finch said. "No lifting, no cooking, no worry. If she has another shock, Caleb, I cannot promise you a happy ending." The warning hung in the air like a sentence. For the next week, Caleb was a tyrant of care. He forbade Maggie from leaving the bed. He did the cooking, burning the biscuits, but serving them with a tenderness that made Maggie weep. He moved her bed near the window so she could see the sky, but he kept the shutters drawn against the heat and the view of the gunman on the horizon. In town, Thomas Hale was losing patience. He stood in Sheriff Miller's office, slamming his fist onto the desk. The sound made the dust jump. "I want him arrested." "Miller!" Thomas shouted. "He is a thief! He stole 20 head of my cattle last week!" "I need proof." "Thomas," the sheriff said, looking tired. "I went out there. I checked his herd. I did not see your brands. He altered them. He is a running iron artist. You have no proof of that either." Thomas leaned over the desk, his face red and sweating. "Investigate him then. Tear his place apart. Dig up his floorboards. Find something. Anything." "I cannot just raid a man's home without cause," the sheriff said, finding a backbone he didn't know he had, especially not when his woman is near her time. "Doctor, Finch says she almost lost the babe last week." Thomas straightened up. His eyes went cold. "You are soft. Miller, that is your problem. You let sentiment get in the way of the law. The law protects him too." "Thomas." Thomas put on his hat. He adjusted the brim with slow, deliberate movements. "If the law will not protect my property," he said quietly, "then I will protect it myself." He walked out. The sheriff watched him go. a sick feeling settling in his stomach. The attack came 3 days later. It was an afternoon that felt like the inside of a furnace. The temperature had climbed to over 100 degrees. The air shimmered above the ground, turning the horizon into a watery blur. Caleb was in the barn, mending a harness. He had sent the 2 hired boys home early because of the heat. It was just him and Maggie on the ranch. Maggie was in the cabin, lying on the bed, fanning herself with a folded paper. She felt heavy, lethargic. The baby was quiet today, resting. Then the dog started barking. It was not the warning bark of a visitor. It was the frantic, snarling bark of a threat. Caleb dropped the harness and grabbed his rifle. He ran to the barn door. Through the heat haze, he saw them. 6 riders. They were coming fast, kicking up a wall of dust. They were not stopping at the gate. They were riding straight for the buildings. "Hail!" Caleb whispered. He saw the torches before he saw the faces. Caleb ran for the cabin. He burst through the door. "Maggie, get up!" Maggie sat up, startled. "Caleb?" "They are here," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her off the bed. "You need to hide." He dragged her toward the kitchen. In the floor of the pantry, there was a trapdoor leading to the root cellar, a dark, cool hole dug into the earth for keeping potatoes and carrots from freezing in winter and rotting in summer. Caleb kicked the rug aside and yanked the ring handle. The door groaned open, revealing a dark square. "Go down," Caleb ordered. Maggie looked at him. His face was white, his eyes wide with fear. Outside, she heard the thunder of hooves and the crack of a pistol shot. "No," she said. "I will not leave you." "Maggie!" Caleb shouted, shaking her. "This is not a debate. Get in the hole." He practically threw her down the ladder. He shoved a heavy Colt revolver into her hand. "If anyone opens this door who is not me, you shoot. You do not ask. You shoot. Do you understand?" "Caleb, I love you," he said. He slammed the trapdoor shut. She heard him drag the heavy kitchen table over it. Then she heard his boots running across the floor, the door slamming, and the world outside exploding into violence. Maggie stood in the dark, clutching the cold metal of the gun. The air smelled of earth and old onions. Above her, the muffled sounds of war began. Gunshots popped like firecrackers. Men shouted. The scream of a horse, then the smell of smoke. It seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. Acrid, burning wood. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a step toward the ladder, intending to push the door open, to fight, to do something. And then the pain hit her. It was not a cramp this time. It was a sledgehammer, a contraction so violent it doubled her over. She dropped the gun. It clattered on the packed earth. She gripped the rough wooden shelves lined with jars of preserves. A low, animal groan escaped her throat. Water gushed down her legs, soaking her dress and her shoes. Now, it was happening now. "No," she whispered to the dark. "Not now. Please God, not now." But the baby did not care about the gunmen. It did not care about the fire. It was coming. Above her, the barn caught fire. The dry wood, seasoned by the summer heat, went up like paper. The roar of the flames was audible even in the cellar. Maggie sank to her knees in the dirt. She was alone, buried alive, with death above her and life fighting to get out of her. Outside, Caleb was fighting a demon. He had taken cover behind the water trough. The barn was a towering inferno, the flames licking 50 feet into the air, sending thick black smoke rolling across the yard. The heat was unbearable, searing the lungs. Hale's men were spread out, using the smoke as cover. Bullets chipped the stone of the trough, buzzing past Caleb's ears like angry hornets. "Come out! Ward!" a voice shouted. It was not Thomas. It was one of the hired guns. "We just want to talk." Caleb levered his Winchester and fired. A man yelped in the distance. "Talk to that," Caleb yelled. He saw a figure running toward the cabin with a torch. "No!" Caleb roared. He broke cover. He didn't think. He just ran. He dropped the man with a shot to the leg. But another rider came out of the smoke, swinging a lariat. It was Thomas Hale. Thomas rode his black stallion through the flames like a horseman of the apocalypse. His face was twisted in a rictus of hate. He fired his pistol, the bullet tearing through Caleb's left sleeve, grazing the skin. Caleb didn't stop. He raised his rifle, but the horse slammed into him. The impact was like being hit by a train. Caleb flew backward, the rifle spinning away into the dust. He landed hard. The wind knocked out of him. He scrambled to his feet, gasping, reaching for his belt knife. Thomas dismounted before the horse had even stopped. He hit the ground running, charging Caleb with the fury of a madman. They collided in the dirt. There was no technique to it. It was two men who hated each other, fighting with fists, knees, and teeth. Thomas was heavier, fueled by the rage of a man losing his kingdom. Caleb was desperate, fighting for the woman beneath the floorboards. Thomas landed a heavy blow to Caleb's bad shoulder. Caleb cried out, his arm going numb. Thomas tackled him, pinning him to the scorching earth. He wrapped his hands around Caleb's throat. "Where is she?" Thomas screamed, spittle flying into Caleb's face. "Where's my heir?" Caleb clawed at Thomas's face, gouging his eye. Thomas roared but didn't let go. His thumbs dug into Caleb's windpipe. Black spots danced in Caleb's vision. The roar of the fire grew distant. "You will never have her," Caleb choked out. Thomas reached for his own gun, which had fallen in the dirt nearby. He grabbed the barrel, intending to pistol whip Caleb into submission. "I will burn this whole place down," Thomas shrieked. "I will sift the ashes for them." He raised the gun. Caleb bucked. He used the last ounce of his strength to arch his back and throw his weight to the side. Thomas, unbalanced, fell sideways. His hand, gripping the gun by the barrel, slammed into a rock. The impact jarred the trigger mechanism. The gun went off. The boom was muffled, close and wet. Thomas froze. His eyes went wide, staring at Caleb with sudden confusion. He slumped forward, rolling off Caleb. Caleb scrambled backward, gasping for air, rubbing his bruised throat. He looked at Thomas. Thomas was lying on his back. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the white of his shirt, just below the ribs. He coughed, a terrible, bubbling sound, and blood flecked his lips. The fighting around them stopped. The hired men, seeing their paymaster down, lowered their guns. The sound of galloping horses approached from the east, the sheriff and a posse. Finally arriving too late to stop the fire, but in time to see the end, Caleb crawled toward Thomas. He didn't know why. Thomas looked up at the smoke-filled sky. His face was gray. It isn't fair," Thomas whispered. He looked at Caleb. The hate was fading, replaced by fear. "I just wanted a son. You had a wife," Caleb rasped. "You threw her away." Thomas coughed again, his body convulsing. She couldn't. She is having the baby." "Thomas," Caleb said, leaning over him. "Right now. It wasn't her. It was never her." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He looked at the sheriff, who was running toward them, kneeling in the dust. "My blood." Thomas gasped, gripping the sheriff's sleeve. "The doctor said my blood was too weak. It never took root." He looked at Caleb one last time. She won." Thomas Hale shuddered. His head lolled back into the dust. The powerful rancher, the king of the valley, was dead. The sheriff looked at Caleb. He had heard it. The men standing nearby had heard it. The doctor said his blood was weak. The lie was dead too. A scream from the cabin cut through the silence. It was a raw, guttural sound of agony. "Maggie," Caleb shouted. He forgot Thomas. He forgot the sheriff. He forgot the fire that was being beaten back by the posse. He ran to the cabin. He threw the door open. Smoke hung in the air, but the fire hadn't taken the main house yet. He heaved the table aside and ripped open the trap door. "Maggie, I am here," she cried from the dark. "Caleb, help me." Caleb practically fell down the ladder. The lantern was flickering, casting long shadows. Maggie was on the floor, her back against the shelves. Her dress was bunched up, her legs spread. She was sweating, her hair matted to her skull. "The baby is coming," she screamed, gripping his hand as he knelt beside her. Caleb looked. He saw the crown of the head. "I am here. Maggie, I am here." He didn't know what to do. He had delivered calves. He had delivered foals. He had never delivered a human. "Just breathe," he said, his voice shaking. "Push when you need to push. I can't. It hurts too much. You can," Caleb said fiercely. "You walked through a blizzard. You survived him. You can do this." He moved between her legs. "I see the head. Maggie, one more. Give me one more." Maggie threw her head back and screamed, a sound that merged with the dying roar of the fire outside. She pushed with everything she had left, pouring all her anger, all her fear, all her love into this one act of creation. Caleb's hands were there. He caught the small, slippery form as it slid into the world. He cleared the mouth, just as he would a calf. A cry, thin, reedy, and furious. It filled the cellar. It filled the cabin. It filled the silence of the death outside. "It's a girl," Caleb whispered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "Maggie, it's a girl." He cut the cord with his belt knife, wiping it on his shirt first. He wrapped the baby in his own flannel overshirt, which he stripped off, leaving him in his undershirt. He handed the bundle to Maggie. Maggie took the child. Her arms were shaking, but her grip was iron. She looked down at the tiny, red face, the squashed nose, the dark hair. She pulled the baby to her chest, rocking back and forth. She was slick with sweat, dirt, and blood. She was exhausted beyond words, but she was alive, and she was free. Caleb knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around both of them. He buried his face in Maggie's neck, and for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Ward wept. He cried for the fear, for the relief, for the sheer, impossible beauty of life in the midst of ruin. Maggie looked down at her daughter. She kissed the tiny forehead. She looked up at the trap door, where the smoke was drifting out and the sunlight was starting to filter in. She thought of Thomas, dead in the dirt. She thought of the town that had scorned her. She looked back at the baby. "They will regret losing you," she whispered, her voice fierce and victorious. She looked at Caleb and smiled through her tears. "But they lost, and we won." The autumn wind that swept across the Wyoming Valley in October of 1879 carried a different scent than the winds of the previous year. It did not smell of coming snow and desperation. It smelled of cured hay, dry sage, and the biting, clean aroma of wood smoke rising from a chimney that had been laid by steady hands. The land itself still bore the memory of the fire. To the east of the cabin, a wide swath of the prairie remained blackened, a dark scar against the tawny gold of the dying grass. But even there, life was stubborn. Green shoots of new growth were pushing up through the char, fed by the summer rains that had finally come to break the drought. The cottonwood trees near the creek, some singed and stripped of bark, had put out fresh leaves before the frost turned them yellow. Maggie Hale stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. It was not the grand house she had lived in with Thomas. It was not even the sturdy, original cabin Caleb had built years ago. It was a patchwork thing, expanded and reinforced with timber salvaged from the unburnt side of the barn and fresh pine cut from the high ridge. It was smaller, rougher, and to Maggie's eyes, the most beautiful structure on God's earth. She wiped her hands on her apron. Her palms were calloused now, the skin rougher than it had ever been when she wore silk and poured tea in the Hale parlor. Her fingernails were short, often rimmed with garden soil or flour, but her back was straight. The constant, grinding ache of her pregnancy was gone, replaced by the fatigue of a mother who slept in 3-hour snatches. Yet she felt a strength in her limbs that she had never known before. She looked out toward the corral. Caleb was there, working on the gate. He was stripping the bark from a cedar post with a draw knife. The rhythm of the blade against the wood, shirk, 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 was a steady heartbeat in the quiet afternoon. He wore a new shirt she had sewn for him, blue flannel that matched the autumn sky. He had lost weight in the months since the fire. The fight and the rebuilding had stripped him down to lean muscle and wire. The scar on his face seemed less angry now, fading into the weathering of his skin. Or perhaps Maggie had simply stopped seeing it as a scar and started seeing it as just another part of the man she loved. The ranch was quiet. They had lost half the herd in the chaos of the raid, scattered to the hills or stolen in the confusion. But the remaining cattle were fat and healthy. their coats growing thick for the coming winter. They were enough. Maggie turned her gaze to the wooden cradle sitting in the shadow of the porch roof. Inside, wrapped in a quilt pieced together from scraps of Maggie's old life and Caleb's worn-out shirts, lay the baby. She was small. She had come into the world amidst smoke and terror, a tiny, screaming thing fighting for her first breath while men died outside. But she had the stubbornness of the weeds that cracked the rock. She had dark hair like her mother and a serious, watchful expression that belonged entirely to Caleb. They had named her Hope. It was a simple name, perhaps a cliché to some, but to them, it was a defiance. To name a child Hope in a place that had tried to kill them was an act of war against despair. Hope stirred, letting out a soft, bird-like cry. Maggie knelt beside the cradle. She reached in and brushed her finger against the baby's cheek. The infant turned her head, her mouth rooting instinctively, and her tiny hand, no bigger than a wildflower, curled around Maggie's finger. "We made it," Maggie whispered, the words a daily ritual. "The frost is coming, little one, but the wood is stacked high. We made it." The peace they had found was hard-won, but the world outside their fence line was not so easily pacified. Oakhaven was a town divided. The death of Thomas Hale had been the most sensational event in the territory since the Indian Wars. The story had traveled all the way to Cheyenne and back, mutating with every telling. To some, Maggie was a pariah. She was the woman who had lived in sin with a squatter while her lawful husband searched for her. She was the woman whose scandalous pregnancy had led to a shootout that killed one of the richest men in the valley. When she rode into town, these people, mostly the wealthy wives of other ranchers and the stiff-necked deacons of the church, would cross the street to avoid her shadow. But to others, the truth had taken root. Sheriff Miller had not been able to unhear Thomas's dying words. "My blood was too weak." The admission, gasped out in the dust while Thomas's life bled away, had shattered the myth of Maggie's barrenness. The hired men, those who survived the fire and the posse's arrival, had talked in the saloon. They spoke of a woman who stood her ground in a blizzard. They spoke of a man who fought like a demon to protect her. So there were those who tipped their hats. The blacksmith, a man who valued iron strength over polite society, now gave Caleb discount rates on horseshoes. The women who worked in the laundry, women who knew what it was to be used and discarded by powerful men, would nod silently at Maggie when she passed, a secret sisterhood of survival. And then there was the law. 2 weeks ago, a solicitor from Cheyenne had ridden out to the ranch. He was a thin, pinched man who looked at their scorched earth with disdain. But he carried papers that bore the seal of the territorial court. The inquest into Thomas's death had been thorough. The sheriff's testimony, combined with the Dr. Finch's deposition about Thomas's medical history, which he finally gave, breaking his silence to serve justice, had painted a clear picture. Thomas Hale had been the aggressor. He had attacked a peaceful homestead. He had died by his own hand, an accidental discharge during an assault he initiated. But the most shocking legal twist came from the marriage contract itself, because Thomas had never legally dissolved the marriage. Maggie was his widow, and because he had died without a will, believing himself immortal, as men like him often did, the law of the territory was clear. The solicitor had sat at their rough-hewn table, sipping coffee that Maggie poured with trembling hands. "The estate is substantial, Mrs. Hale," the solicitor had said. "However, Mr. Silas Hale, the father, is contesting everything. He claims you abandoned the marriage and forfeited your rights." Maggie had looked at Caleb. He was standing by the door, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a silent sentinel. "I do not want the ranch," Maggie had said quietly. "I do not want his house. I do not want his cattle. I never want to set foot on Hale land again." The solicitor had nodded, looking relieved. "That simplifies matters. The elder Mr. Hale is willing to offer a settlement to prevent a protracted legal battle that would drag the family name further through the mud. He offers a clean break." He placed a bank draft on the table. $2,000, the solicitor said. and a deed releasing any claim you have to the Hale estate. In exchange, they drop all threats of litigation regarding the circumstances of the child's birth. $2,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy 5 herds. It was enough to build a house of brick and glass. It was enough to leave Wyoming forever and live in comfort in San Francisco or St. Louis. Maggie had stared at the paper. It felt heavy, as if it were soaked in blood. "It is his money," she had whispered. "It feels dirty." Caleb had spoken then, his voice low and rough. "It is not a gift, Maggie, it is back wages." He walked over and placed his large hand over hers on the table. "For 5 years of service, for the insults, for the bruises, for the night he put you in a wagon and sent you to die in the snow." Caleb looked at the solicitor with eyes like flint. "She will take it, and you will tell Silas Hale that if he ever sends another rider near this land, I will spend every cent of it on ammunition." They had signed the papers. Now, the money sat in an account in Cheyenne. They had used a small portion of it immediately. They paid off the note on Caleb's land, making it fully theirs. They bought winter feed. They bought new glass for the windows and a cast-iron stove that didn't smoke, but Maggie still struggled with it. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange, she sat on the porch with hope at her breast. The air was cooling rapidly, a reminder that winter was waiting in the wings. Caleb came up the steps, dusting sawdust from his trousers. He sat heavily on the bench beside her, groaning slightly as he stretched his bad leg. "Fence is done," he said. "It is straight this time. Even a hail bull won't break through it." Maggie smiled down at the baby, who was nursing with rhythmic, quiet sounds. Caleb reached out and touched the baby's head, his fingers rough and scarred against the soft, dark down of her hair. The contrast always made Maggie's heart ache, the violence of the world and the gentleness of the man who held it at bay. "You are thinking about the money again," Caleb said. He didn't ask, he stated it. He knew her moods as well as he knew the weather. "It feels like we are building our life on his bones," Maggie admitted, looking out at the darkening prairie. Caleb leaned back, resting his head against the cabin wall. "We are building our life on this land. Maggie, the money is just a tool, like a hammer or a plow. It has no soul. You have the soul." He turned his head to look at her. "Thomas tried to destroy you. He failed. That money, it is just the universe balancing the scales, a very small balance, for what you endured." He reached over and took her free hand. "Do not let him win by feeling guilty. Maggie, he is dead. We are alive. That is the only victory that matters." Maggie squeezed his hand. She looked at the baby, fat and warm and safe. "You are right," she whispered. "We are alive." The intimacy between them had changed since the birth. The desperate, storm-fueled passion of that first night had deepened into something steadier, quieter, but infinitely more powerful. They were no longer two lonely people clinging to each other in a lifeboat. They were partners captaining a ship. They moved around the small cabin with a synchronized grace. When Maggie cooked, Caleb washed the bowls. When Caleb came in freezing from the late chores, Maggie had warm water ready for his hands. They laughed over small things. The way the dog slept with his paws in the air. The way Hope made a face when she tasted her first drop of cow's milk. The time Caleb tripped over the rocking chair and swore in front of the baby, causing Maggie to throw a dish rag at him. But the shadow of the past still lingered, hiding in the corners of the room. One night in late November, the wind picked up. It was a howling, shrieking wind that sounded too much like the blizzard of '78. Caleb had been out late, checking the north ridge where the wolves had been spotted. He was overdue. Maggie sat by the stove, rocking the cradle. The fire was popping. Every gust of wind that rattled the door latch made her jump. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. She was afraid of the loss. She looked at the room, the warmth, the child, the life she had built. It was so fragile. One fall from a horse, one stray bullet, one bad winter, It could all be snatched away just as she had finally learned to breathe. The door opened. Caleb blew in with a gust of snow. He was covered in white, his beard frosted, his eyes tired. Maggie stood up so fast she nearly knocked over the chair. "You are late," she said, her voice tight. The drift on the pass was deep. Caleb said, unwinding his scarf, "I had to walk the horse down." He looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she was gripping her own elbows. He abandoned his coat on the hook and walked straight to her. He did not care that he was cold and she was warm. He pulled her into his arms. "I am here," he murmured into her hair. "I am always coming back." Maggie buried her face in his frozen shirt. "I feel broken sometimes, Caleb," she whispered, the confession tumbling out. "I look at you and I look at hope, and I feel like I am waiting for the punishment, for being happy." "Punishment?" Caleb pulled back, holding her face in his cold hands. "The town, they still look at me," the women whisper. "I feel like I am tainted, like I don't deserve this clean life." Caleb's eyes were fierce. "Listen to me, Maggie." He waited until she met his gaze. "You are not broken. You are forged. Iron is not broken when it comes out of the fire. It is steel." He kissed her forehead, then her eyelids, then her mouth. "And as for the town, let them look. Let them whisper. They are looking at a woman who walked out of hell carrying a child. They are looking at a queen, and they know it. That is why they are afraid." He picked her up. He lifted her effortlessly, just as he had on the night he found her. But this time there was no hesitation. "I choose you," he said against her lips. "Every morning when the sun comes up, I choose you. Not because I have to, not because of the baby, but because the world makes sense when you are in it." He carried her to the bed behind the curtain. The baby was asleep. The wind howled outside, powerless to touch them. Their lovemaking that night was slow, a deliberate mapping of skin and soul. It was a conversation without words, a reaffirmation of the vow they had made in the root cellar. Caleb touched her scars, the silver stretch marks on her belly, the faint shadow of old bruises on her soul, with a reverence that made Maggie weep. And she held his scarred face, kissing the jagged line that marked his own pain, healing him with every touch. The next morning broke clear and cold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. Maggie woke to find the bed empty. She threw on her shawl and went to the window. Caleb was in the yard. He was holding Hope, bundled tightly in a sheepskin blanket. He was walking the perimeter of the fence, pointing things out to the 2-month-old baby. Maggie cracked the window open to listen. "And that is the East Ridge," Caleb was saying, his voice a low rumble. "That is where the sun comes up. And over there, that is where the herd sleeps." He turned and pointed to the mountains. "And that is where the water comes from. It is good land, Sarah. It is hard land, but it is good. And it is yours." He looked down at the bundle. "You are going to be strong, like your mama. You are going to ride horses and read books, and no man is ever going to tell you that you are useless. If they do, I will shoot them." Maggie laughed, a sound that startled a raven on the fence post. Caleb looked up. He saw her in the window, her hair loose, her face glowing with the morning light. He smiled, a true, open smile that reached his eyes. He lifted the baby up, presenting her to Maggie like a prize. "She says she is hungry," Caleb called out, "and she says her father talks too much." Maggie felt a rush of love so intense it nearly knocked the wind out of her. It was a physical weight, pressing on her chest, anchoring her to the earth. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. 2 days later, they hitched up the wagon. It was Sunday. "We're going to town," Caleb announced. Maggie hesitated. "We don't need supplies." "We are not going for supplies," Caleb said, putting on his good hat. "We're going to church." Maggie stared at him. Caleb Ward had not set foot in a church in 10 years. "Why? Because it is time," he said. He helped her into the wagon. He handed her Hope. He climbed up beside her, and they rode into Oak Haven. They did not sneak in. They rode down the center of Main Street at high noon. Caleb sat tall, looking every man he passed in the eye. Maggie held her head high. the baby sleeping against her chest. They pulled up in front of the white clapboard church just as the service was letting out. The congregation spilled onto the steps. They stopped when they saw the wagon. Silence rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, clutched her prayer book. Mr. Abernathy, the clerk who had written the letter, looked at his boots, his face pale. Caleb set the brake. He climbed down and walked around to help Maggie. He lifted her down with the care of a man handling fine porcelain. They walked up the path to the gate. Reverend Hayes stood at the top of the stairs. He looked at Caleb, then at Maggie, then at the baby. The preacher remembered the scene in the sheriff's office. He remembered the truth that had been shouted in that room. He looked at his flock, seeing the judgment in some eyes and the shame in others. Mr. Ward. The Reverend said, Mrs. Hale. Caleb nodded. Reverend, we have come to introduce our daughter, Hope. The Reverend looked at the baby. He saw the life there. He saw the family standing before him, forged in fire, bound by a loyalty that shamed the vows of many who sat in his pews every week. He walked down the steps. The crowd parted. Reverend Hayes stopped in front of them. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched the blanket. Hope, he said softly. A fitting name. He looked at Maggie. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Margaret, and his mercy is new every morning. He raised his voice so the town could hear, bless this child, and bless this family. It was not a full apology. It was not a grand declaration, but it was enough. Some of the townsfolk turned away, still clinging to their prejudice. But others, the blacksmith, the laundry women, even the sheriff, nodded, one by one. They tipped their hats or offered a small smile. Maggie accepted the blessing with a polite inclination of her head. She did not need their approval. She had Caleb. She had Hope. But she accepted their peace. On the way out of town, Maggie asked Caleb to stop. The cemetery was on a low hill overlooking the valley. It was a windswept place, dotted with slate markers and wooden crosses. I need a minute, Maggie said. Caleb nodded. Take your time. Maggie walked through the dry grass. She found the fresh grave near the iron fence of the Hale family plot. The stone was simple granite. Thomas Hale, 1845, 1879. There were no flowers. Maggie stood over the grave. The wind tugged at her skirts and blew hair across her face. She adjusted the baby in her arms. She felt nothing. She had expected anger. She had expected fear. She had expected grief for the boy she had married years ago. But there was only a quiet emptiness. The monster was gone. The power he had held over her, the power to define her worth, was buried 6 feet under the dirt. You were wrong. Thomas, she said to the stone. Her voice did not tremble. You thought you could crush me to save your pride. You thought I was weak. She looked down at Hope, who was watching the clouds drift by with wide, dark eyes. She lifted the baby slightly. This is Hope, Maggie said to the grave. She is strong, she is healthy, and she is loved. She looked out at the valley, stretching wide and golden under the autumn sun. She saw Caleb waiting by the wagon, his eyes fixed on her, ready to come to her side at the slightest signal. You pushed me out, Maggie whispered. You thought you were sending me to my death, but you pushed me toward my life. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. Thank you for that. She turned her back on the grave. She walked back down the hill, her step light. Caleb watched her come. He saw the peace in her face. Ready? He asked. Maggie climbed onto the wagon seat. She settled the baby. She looked at the man who sat beside her, the scarred, quiet, steadfast man who had rebuilt her world with his own 2 hands. I am ready, she said. Let's go home. The sun was setting as they reached the ranch. The sky was a masterpiece of the American West, a vast, bruised canvas of crimson, indigo, and burning gold. The mountains cast long purple shadows across the grass. Caleb unhitched the horses and turned them into the corral. He walked up to the porch where Maggie was waiting. They stood together, leaning against the railing, watching the light fade from the land. The air grew cold, but the cabin behind them was warm, the stove glowing, the lamp lit in the window. The land was still unforgiving. The winter would come, and it would be hard. There would be wolves. There would be droughts. There would be years when the cattle died and the crops failed. The prejudice of the town would not vanish overnight. It would linger like smoke. But as Caleb put his arm around Maggie's waist, and she rested her head on his shoulder, none of that mattered. They had built a fortress, not of logs and stone, but of truth and loyalty. They had looked into the face of death and chosen life. Maggie listened to the wind singing in the new wire of the fences. She listened to the soft breathing of her daughter. She listened to the steady beat of Caleb's heart. She remembered the woman she had been, shivering in the snow, whispering a desperate promise to a belly that everyone said was empty. "They will regret losing you." She smiled as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. They had lost everything, and she had found everything. Maggie turned to Caleb, rising on her toes to kiss the scar on his cheek. "We are home," she said. Caleb pulled her close, shielding her and the child from the coming night. "We are home. Thank you so much for journeying with me through this story of Maggie and Caleb. I hope you felt the dust of the plains and the warmth of the cabin fire. It has been an honor to bring this Wild West romance to life for you. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. Did the ending bring you the peace you hoped for? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of love, survival, and the untamed frontier. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your hearths warm.